want to welcome the commission members that are here. Our numbers are a little thin. I think the flu season, etc., has made it challenging for some to join, as well as the hecticness around what happens in December. But welcome everybody who is able to attend. We have a pretty packed agenda and that we want to go through. But before we do that, want to just thank the public for the written comments that were submitted. There were some excellent suggestions in those comments, and the commissioners were able to review those before the meeting. And we will also be taking public comment during this meeting. Linda, will you remind people how they can let us know that they want to testify and what they need to do to testify?
Down by your the emoji, you're going to see a little button that says, it'll have the emoji will have a hand. You can click on that and that'll raise the hand, and it'll put you on the list up underneath the list of panelists, and therefore it'll put you on the list to be able to call on for your testimony. If you want to do a written one, or you want to do it during the actual conversation, go ahead and put I would like to comment in the chat, and we will see that and call on you when it becomes available. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Depending on how many people want to testify, we'll ask people to combine their comments to between 1 and 3 minutes. And if you can't get all of your comments in, as Linda mentioned, you can put them in the chat. We pull the chat notes for part of our meeting recording. And certainly you're welcome to send us testimony after the meeting, and we'll distribute that to commission members. Just as a reminder for commissioners, it can be challenging to see raised hands. So if you want to make a comment and I haven't called on you, please just unmute yourself and chime in. After a few updates, we will take roll call. And for my update, I wanted to just give an update on the Oregon Global Warming Commission's Natural and Working Lands work stream. It's been moving ahead at pace. As a reminder to the public, you can see who is on the committee, and you can follow the work that the committee is doing and the progress at ogwcnaturallandworkinglands.org. And there's a standalone website that has all the materials. We have had 3 meetings of the 27-person advisory committee, and we've had a collective meeting of all the ad hoc technical team members. We've been engaged about 45 technical experts to date. We're currently working on development of the activity-based metrics and a methodology for establishing an inventory of net sequestration in Oregon's natural and working lands. One of the exciting pieces of news today is that we've completed one of the deliverables for that project, and that was a deliverable around development of a request for information, or sometimes called a request for quotations, on the workforce and training needs assessment that was part of the Natural and Working Lands proposal. That is ready to, is finalized now with great input and discussion from the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. And we're ready to send it out to get quotations. And our plan is, I believe, to send it out in early January. We're intending to use the information we received from that RFI to both refine the scope of work and to determine the potential cost of doing the work. And that will help us inform efforts to try and find funding to be able to implement, hire a contractor and implement that work. So we're excited about that that first product and the importance of that to the natural and working lands efforts in the state. Workforce and training needs was one of the most frequent comments that we heard from stakeholders as we were doing the input on the natural and working lands proposal. So that's my update. In recognition that we're headed into the legislative session, I wanted to ask Senator Dembro to talk about 2 legislative concepts related to the Oregon Global Warming Commission's work that he will be advancing during the 2023 legislative session. Senator Dembro?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, this is a crazy time for us legislators. Our deadline for introducing or submitting bills for introduction is next week. So we're doing a lot of scrambling. But I do have 2 legislative concepts that are very closely related to the work of this commission that I would like to give a brief overview of, if that's okay.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So the first one is it's LC 1979. And it has to do with modernizing Oregon's climate action, and more specifically, modernizing the work of this commission. And, just to remind you, during the 2007 session, the legislature took a number of groundbreaking climate action steps, including creating the Environmental Justice Task Force, this body, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, and setting our greenhouse gas goals of 75% of reducing our emissions to 75% of 1990 emissions by 2050. And these were very important first steps. Oregon was among the first states to set greenhouse gas reduction goals based on the best science at the time. It was very meaningful that we created a commission to gather data and oversee reporting of our progress on achieving the greenhouse gas goals. And it was very meaningful that we put an ongoing spotlight on the needs of environmental justice communities in the front lines of climate disruption. These were quite unique, the EJ Task Force and the Global Warming Commission, but neither of them really received the institutional support needed to fully do the work intended. 15 years later, it's time for them to be brought into the 21st century, and that's the purpose of this LC. Actually, with respect to the environmental justice work, you may remember that in 2021, we did take an important step in passing House Bill 4077, which acknowledged the crucial work of the EJ Task Force by renaming it to the Environmental Justice Council, clarifying its purpose, and at long last giving it the resources that it needs to properly do its work. This LC 1979, does the same for the Oregon Global Warming Commission and our greenhouse gas goals. And so here are the major elements of it. First of all, it changes the name of the Oregon Global Warming Commission to the Oregon Climate Action Commission. Bringing us into the 21st century, I think, and better reflecting our understanding of climate disruptions and the actions needed to reduce emissions and create more resiliency in the face of those disruptions. It modifies our greenhouse gas reduction goals to make them consistent with the governor's executive order that is raising it to 80% of 1990 emissions by 2050. It allows for future reduction proposals as science changes. It adds 2 new voting members to the commission, one that would represent environmental justice communities and one representing youth. It clarifies the role of the commission in overseeing the progress being made by state agencies in meeting our climate goals. It adds additional agency representatives as ex officio non-voting members in order to better coordinate the state's efforts. It clarifies a focus on the role of climate smart solutions for our natural and working lands, around sequestration and storage, for example. And then finally, it clarifies the responsibility of preparing a detailed forecast of expected greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that is what the LC does. It will come out with the rest of the legislative bills on January 17th, along with a list of sponsors. So I could answer any quick questions that you might have about that. Would this be the appropriate time for that, Chair?
Yeah, I think it just a couple of questions. We can also talk more about this in our January meeting.
Great.
But commissioners, if you have clarifying question. I think one of the exciting things is the 2 new positions that you described that I think came up in our November meeting. So
Right.
great to have that so quickly incorporated into legislation.
Yeah.
Senator
Oh,
Dembro,
yes.
just one question. Gabriella Goldfarb on behalf
Hey.
of Rachel Banks. Hello. At Oregon Health Authority. And, you know, the original legislation had one line addressing adaptation. And given your reference to resilience, I am just curious whether there's a broadening beyond mitigation to have more of an explicit kind of adaptation and resilience focus.
Yeah, I believe that is included in it, Gabriella. You know, certainly that underlies the thinking here.
Yeah, it sounded like it from what you described.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. I will say, you know, I have to add that for the commission to do the work that's called out here, you know, in this LC, it most likely will require some additional funding, you know, to be honest. And, you know, we have been, I think, very grateful for the Department of Energy for carrying the load here. But, you know, we need to do the work that this commission needs to do. It needs more stable institutional support. So that will also be part of this conversation.
Absolutely, that's very welcome.
Yeah. Okay, let me. No, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. I think you're going where I was asking.
Yeah, I was going to go ahead and mention the second bill, which is directly related to the what, Chair, you were just talking about in terms of the natural and working lands. So this is LC 3026, which deals with natural climate solutions. And this bill will follow up on the much needed work that this commission has been doing on the use of our natural and working lands as part of our broader climate action strategies. And you may remember that following the release of the commission's report on natural and working lands a year ago, we quickly put together a bill for the short session in order to begin this conversation around the relationship between natural and working lands and our climate action. It didn't pass in the short session, but it did lay the groundwork for this LC, which is also about to be submitted for the long session. And, you know, just in short, you know, we all know that Oregon is blessed with a variety of natural and working lands that under the right conditions and with the right management practices have a real capacity to complement our efforts to reduce emissions in meeting our climate goals. But natural climate solutions, well, they're a key, but they're currently a missing piece of climate action in Oregon and not really to be found anywhere in state statutes. So what this bill will do is it will define natural climate solutions and natural and working lands in statute, and include a series of findings around their relationship to climate action. It'll direct state agencies to start thinking seriously about these opportunities in a coordinated manner. It'll also direct state agencies to leverage federal funding and private investments, supporting voluntary incentives and provide funding for land acquisitions, strengthen education, engagement, and technical assistance efforts, and ensure that these benefits are equitably distributed. I don't need to tell this group that while the focus of this bill is on carbon sequestration and storage, it's important to recognize that many of these practices also improve climate resilience to impacts such as flooding, heat waves, drought, wildfire, and the loss of biodiversity. It'll create a natural and working lands fund that will allow ODF, ODA, OWEB, and ODFW to provide match requirements for federal dollars and ensure financial support for landowners, land managers, tribes, and environmental justice communities. It will, as I say, provide a coordinated mechanism for the agencies in developing their applications for grants, but also in monitoring and reporting on how the fund was used and what projects were completed. And it will put into statute the various projects that are currently going on around the different metrics, community-based metrics, the workforce issues, the research that's being done there. And it does set this commission as the entity that will coordinate and oversee this work with support from the Department of Energy. So that in a nutshell is what the Natural Climate Solutions Bill will do. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions.
A little behind time, so if anybody has a quick question.
This is Commissioner Jackson, if I can just quickly make a comment. First, both bills sound, piece of legislation sound very in line with what we've been moving forward in this commission. So I'm very supportive, especially the environmental justice you indicated in both. Definitely on the LC 3026, the second one you mentioned something about direct state agencies to think about opportunities. Would always welcome stronger language than just thinking about them. And I also noticed a little bit of the absence of any job creation or workforce development as it relates to that. We know that's closely tied to the economic vitality, the support throughout the state, both in the rural and metro areas, and also how it affects the, and ties into environmental justice for people affected by any of the changes that are being proposed. So definitely, a bigger discussion for another day, but definitely very supportive of all the language you presented today. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
Commissioner
Commissioner. Yeah,
Oh, Go ahead.
because of the pressure of time, I didn't go into all the details of the LC, but I will make them available to the commissioners. And everything that you've mentioned is specified, within the LC. It's called out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Very exciting, Senator Dembrow. So glad to see this moving forward on both fronts. And keeping with the theme of discussing legislation, pending legislation, I'd like to invite Representative Helm to speak to a piece of legislation that he and Representative Owens, who I have not seen yet in the participants list, but if you'd like to go ahead,
McDonald.
Representative
Chair
Helm.
McDonald, there's two people on the phone. One might be Rep Owens.
Great.
But we haven't
Okay, well,
identified
welcome.
them.
If you're on the phone, Representative Owens, we're pleased to have
If they could
you.
identify themselves, that would be great.
Madam Chair, I received a text from Rep. Owens earlier today saying he wouldn't be able to attend. So, and I am coming to you all from the Redmond City Hall in Central Oregon. So there may be a little background noise. If it's too much, then just let me know and we'll do something else. I just wanted to highlight for the public and the commission LC 2356. Which is a bill that's designed to help the state pull down the abundant federal funding that is available to us through the multitude of infrastructure and other federal actions that provide money to states. The bill sets up an infrastructure to get infrastructure money, is the best way to put it. And Rep. Owens and I have wanted something like this for several sessions. Working with the Water Futures Project and understanding some of their findings around what other states have done to be effective in pulling down money through federal programs helped us understand that the states that are effective at doing that, they have some sort of hub with dedicated staff that understand both federal funding and grant making and writing. Bobby Cochran, who worked on the Water Futures Project and was with us earlier this week on a water forum, mentioned that his memory was states that had a hub for this purpose were 14% more effective in bringing federal funding to them, and that states that did not were an additional 14% less effective. So really getting into this mode and getting a team together will increase our chances by about 30% across the board. So the bill is fairly complicated because it sets up under regional solutions and the governor's office, several advisory committees and an infrastructure cabinet that will be the center point of the efforts here. And the idea is that this will be the nerve center across all agencies for getting federal funding. And through that mechanism, we should be more effective. So I won't go into any more detail than that. We wanted to let the commission know that this is on the way. It should be a piece of bipartisan legislation, I would think. And the only issue is, do we get the necessary funding to staff it appropriately to make it effective, both to pull federal money into state coffers for our work, but also through to counties, cities, and local communities that have needs, particularly with natural resource issues connected to water, wildfire, drought, etc. So
Thank you,
I'll
Representative Helm.
try to answer any questions if you have them.
If somebody has a quick question. Hearing none. It's very exciting, very supportive of the Natural and Working Lands Bill intent, and it's just incredibly good timing given the funding that's been recently approved by Congress for infrastructure, natural and otherwise. So it's really exciting to hear that. In the interest of time, I'm gonna ask anyone else who wanted to provide an update to hold it to the January meeting. And I want to now do roll call, and I'll quickly go down the list. Voting members, Commissioner Reitman.
Here.
Commissioner Apter.
Here.
Commissioner Jackson.
Here.
Excellent. I don't see any other voting members on the call. Non-voting members, Senator Dembro, who we know is here.
Sorry, here.
Representative Helm.
I'm here, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm going to step out at this time and go back to the meeting that I was at originally. And thanks everybody for your good work on the natural and working lands issues. I really appreciate it. Happy holidays when they get here.
Thank you, Representative Helm. Gabriella Goldfarb, representing Rachel.
Yeah, thank you.
I see Colin McConaughey representing DEQ. I believe. Oh, excuse me, Nels Johnson representing David Anderson.
Here.
Thank you. I will try Laura Hart representing Oregon Department of Water Resources.
Here.
Danny Norlander is with us representing ODF.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
We have a staff person from Representative Finley's office, Sierra Watson.
Yes, I am here.
Welcome. Going back to Colin McConaughey, representing DEQ.
Here, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Thanks.
If I missed calling on you and you are representing a non-voting member or a voting member, oh, excuse me, Director Bateman.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
DLCD.
Hi,
Kathy.
Kathy. This is Judith Callens here today for Oregon Department of Agriculture. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Kathy, I have two people on the phone. I was going to go ahead and ask them to introduce themselves because I'm unable to put a name with them. So just a moment and I'll pull them up and ask their names just in case they happen to be.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll call on Suzanne Carlson.
Suzanne Carlson, representing Director Chris Strickler for ODOT.
Great. I went down my list and not in a linear order, and I thought I'd already asked you, so I apologize.
No problem. Great.
Caller, I have caller number 2, and it's 510450, and then the last 4 digits are out. Can you give us your name and where you're calling from?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Scott Pazetsky, member of the public, and I'm on the Climate Action Committee of the Jewish Community Relations Council.
Thank you for attending today.
Oh, happy to be part of this.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and put you back on mute. I'm going to ask the other individual who called in. Thank you.
Great.
Hi,
Hi.
what's your name and where are you calling in from?
This is Mike Bazmarowski, Oregon Department of Agriculture. The panelist password did not work for me, so that's why I'm calling in.
Okay. Thank you. I'll see if I can get you in on the and promote you.
All right,
Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey,
That's it.
thank you very much. It's great to have everyone here with us today that's able to attend. If we can go to the next slide, please. Zach, I think you're driving.
Should be, is it not shared?
It's not updating on my end, but that could be my computer. I'm gonna.
See it?
I see it, Zach. The meeting overview doesn't.
There we go. I've got it. I've got it now too. It was just a little slow. So this is our agenda for today. And we'll just keep this up for reference. We will have public comment, maybe a little later than 2 to 2:20, depending on, given that we're a little bit behind. But we've got quite a bit of material to cover, and then we on the scoring results, and then we wanted to hear some public comment before we go back into the discussion of those, of how we will use those results. Next slide, please. Just a reminder of where we are in the process. The good news is we're in the home stretch, but we are a little bit behind where we had hoped to be. Next slide. Today's outcomes, however, are to review and discuss the scoring results and how we can apply them to the roadmap recommendations. And then want to return to the discussion that we had at our November meeting of the draft recommendations for the roadmap, and in particular to follow up on a request from the commissioners to provide additional information on goals for the commission to consider. Next slide, please. Just to circle back to the fact that we're a little bit behind where we had hoped to be, we would prefer to get materials out for public comment in advance of our meetings. And the project over the last couple of months, there's just been a lot of work to do, especially to implement the co-benefits analysis, but a lot of work kind of broadly coming together. So we're a little bit behind schedule. As a result, we are extending the written comments on the materials that we are presenting today. So we will take public comment until January 5th on those. We have our next commission meeting is scheduled on January 13th. We just finalized that, and an invite will be going out to commissioners for that meeting. It's going to be in the morning on the 13th. We'll take written comments on the draft recommendations that we discussed at that January 13th meeting until the 23rd of January. And then we'll have, we've added a commission meeting to finalize all of the recommendations, and we're going to look to schedule that between the end of January and early February. We'll have a subcommittee that will weigh in on the parts of the report that are not part of the finalized recommendations that will be available at that last meeting in late January, early February. And then we'll get the full document to our folks that format our reports, and we're expecting to be able to deliver it by March 1st. But we will have the draft recommendations by late January, early February, so in plenty of time to influence any activities in the long session. So a little bit behind where we wanted to be, but important to do the work well, and we wanted to make sure we got the co-benefits analysis and evaluation criteria right. So I think it's worth taking a little more time. Zach, did you want to add anything to that or highlight?
No, thanks, Chair McDonald. That was a good summary, and just ending on what you said, which is that we wanted to make sure that folks had an opportunity to dig into the co-benefits analysis and review it, because we're just being able to share it with you today, and we will be posting more information on the website so that folks can take a look and provide any written comments that they'd like.
Thank you, Zach. Next slide, please. And so for our first agenda item, which is to get a bit of a reminder of, to get a little reminder on where we've come. We were excited to see that with the existing programs and regulations that we have in place, we are projecting, if we put a lot of work into implementation of those programs and provide the resources to the agencies that they will need to implement those effectively, that we would achieve the Executive Order 2035 goal on time, which is exciting. This is a very different projection than we have had in the past. Our last projection did not have us anywhere near meeting the goals that were set out in the executive order. So very exciting that that we're meeting the goal. And then the next slide, please. And so that caused the commission to decide that we wanted to look at accelerating the goal and developing scenarios to look at meeting the 2035 goal by 2030. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Alan, and you can take us through the scenarios and the co-benefits analysis of the actions in those scenarios.
Great. Thank you, Chair McDonald. Can you hear me okay?
Can.
Good. Yeah, so with meeting the being on track to meet the goals by 2035, the commission, like Chair McDonald said, investigated whether or not to accelerate the goal and achieve it by 2030. And to do that, needed to identify a set of actions that would be sufficient to do that and do the extra about 7 million metric tons. And we did that. And we did that by developing two different scenarios, an electrification scenario and a hybrid scenario. The hybrid scenario was originally an alternative fuels scenario, which relied heavily on RNG and hydrogen, but we found that there just simply wasn't enough RNG and hydrogen to be able to do one that was predominantly that. So we had to combine that hybrid the RNG and hydrogen with a lot of other actions that were from the electrification. So that's why it's called the hybrid. So it's a combination of hybrid actions and the RNG and hydrogen actions. Next slide, please. So both the scenarios are set up with the actions to meet the goal. So the electrification scenario meets the earlier goal of the 2035 goal by 2030. Next slide, please. And so does the hybrid scenario, where it also meets the goal with the set of actions that we put forward. Next slide, please. Incorporated, because there's an overlap, there's a lot of common actions in both scenarios. There's these group of a whole bunch of different actions that are in the electrification and in the hybrid. There were a few that we were identified. The 100% new EV sales ended up being in the programs and regulations adopted and under development. So that one isn't going to be included in this analysis. And then there were two other ones that were also adopted by the legislature and DEQ, the Recycling Modernization Act, RMA, and the landfill program, which were also included in the programs and regulations adopted or under development. So those were not analyzed in this group as well. There was another big action that we wanted to include, but we just didn't have the information and it wasn't ready for us to be able to do that in moving forward. And Zach, you want to explain the embodied carbon one on the next slide?
Sure, thanks, Alan. Yeah, so we had some really great conversations with Oregon DEQ, and they were able to identify kind of a package of actions around embodied carbon, the idea that building materials and other materials for construction and the like do have embodied carbon in them, in addition to the emissions that come from being in those buildings and living and working in those buildings. So what's interesting is the set of actions that DEQ was able to identify preliminarily using calculations are really have really huge greenhouse gas emissions reduction potentials. So you can see there's sector-based, if we just look at sector-based related emissions, which is what the TIGR analysis is keyed to, it's about 42 million metric tons through 2050. And then if you include consumption-based emissions, which are those emissions kind of outside of the state through production and manufacturing of the materials that may happen somewhere else, you get up to 123, 124 million metric tons. And to put some of this in perspective, the 42 million metric tons, our 1990 levels were about 57 million metric tons of emissions. So huge potential there. And the actions that we've identified through the TIGR scenario analysis, I think the closest one was about half of that number. So there's a lot here and a lot of potential. And some of the actions that DEQ had identified as part of this package could be to use environmental product declarations with materials where they're kind of like nutrition labels for building materials to see the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions related to those materials. Also measuring and disclosing the whole life cycle emissions of a building during the design process could help inform the ultimate design of the buildings and choices of materials. And then the other component was adaptive reuse of existing building materials and road materials. So as Alan said, we didn't have all of the data to be able to score these actions, but there's a lot of opportunity here and potential for further study and analysis and action. And just to put a pin in that and to say that we did at the November meeting discuss some draft recommendations around consumption-based emissions, which this could potentially fall under, and we're continuing conversations with DEQ about this item. So I'll turn it back to Alan.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that that TIGR is not a static thing, and the roadmap's not a static thing. It's going to be going on and on. There'll be we plan on doing it every 2 years with funding, if funding is made available. But we plan on doing TIGR 2.0 to incorporate things like this, but also things that came into being while we were doing the analysis or towards the tail end, actually, like the IIJA and IRA bills from the federal dollars and how they impact this analysis. That's not included here because we just don't have that data yet, but by TIGR 2.0 we'll be able to incorporate that and see what the impact they have on that. Next slide, Zach. So as well as those common actions that were in both scenarios, there were some actions that are unique to each scenario. So there's some that were in the electrification scenario only, and some that were only in the hybrid scenario. But there's only a handful of those. There's like five and six. So this is basically the difference between the two scenarios, whether or not these actions move forward or not. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do was move forward and look at these scenario actions and score them and rank them. In order to do that, we had to estimate the cost and benefit and get the net cost or benefit, as well as the greenhouse gas reduction, which we've done. And that allows us to do what's traditionally been done in climate planning, which is a marginal abatement cost curves or MAC curves. I don't know why they're called curves because they're straight lines, but so each action has its own cost effectiveness calculation of dollars per metric tons of CO2 equivalent that are reduced. So, and that's a common way of laying out these things. And so we've all seen the MAC curves where some were below the line and some are above the line, cost effective and not benefits and cost. And if you were just to purely do a climate action plan based on cost effectiveness, you would start on the left and do the cost effective ones and go to the ones that have a cost to the right. So you'd have this purely economic one in that kind of order. Of course, you wouldn't do them sequentially, but you would start with the ones that are most cost effective and do the ones that are least cost effective later. And hopefully their cost reduced by the time you get there. But we wanted to go beyond that. And we wanted to go beyond just the pure economics and include co-benefits in the evaluation. So we worked with the commission to identify several evaluation criteria that included co-benefits. And next slide, please. So the commission settled on six evaluation criteria: the amount of greenhouse gas reduction, the cost effectiveness metric or MAC curve stuff, and then 3 co-benefits, one on equity, one on health, and one on jobs and economic prosperity. As well, we incorporated risk and uncertainty as an evaluation criteria. The chart to the right, the pie chart, shows you kind of roughly how the distribution or weighting. We assumed there was 100 points to be allocated per action on these different criteria when we scored each of them. And the biggest one, of course, is the greenhouse gas emission reduction, and then roughly the rest of them are all about equal. Next slide, please. This probably looks familiar to, it's an eye chart, it's not supposed to be red unless you have a magnifying glass, but this should look familiar to the commission members. This is the what we ended up with as the evaluation criteria. But what's important about this is that we had sub-criteria that we identified and defined what each of these evaluation criteria is, and the sub-criteria were then able to be used and evaluated. Next slide, please. So when we break that down into a more simplified format, we had the 6 evaluation criteria across the top with their score weightings on the next line down, and then the sub-criteria. And each of the sub-criteria had their own weightings. So for instance, for health benefits, there were 2 avoided health impacts and reduced other health risks, and they were about 50, they were 50-50, so each one was worth 7.5 points total maximum. When we started to apply all this, it all worked pretty much according to COIL until we got to the alleviating energy burden one, and that one ended up not being the best metric to be able to use in evaluating criteria. And again, the purpose of evaluating and scoring the criteria or the actions is to distinguish them within the group. So from highest to lowest. And the fact that we only had energy burden data for those actions that affected households left out all the transportation, all the business and commercial and industrial actions. So it ended up not being a very good metric because it kind of weighted. So we changed the equity co-benefit to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 to 40-20-40 and lowered the weighting of the alleviate energy burden equity metric because it just wasn't a very good metric for distinguishing, but we left it in there. Next slide, please. With all of those evaluation criteria and sub-criteria and the points associated with them, the next step was to get this list of action. Again, this is a more detailed list of all the actions that we had put into the scenario modeling that we have done. And there were 27 on the electrification, 25 on the hybrid. The ones highlighted in blue are the ones that are unique to that scenario. So there were 6 on the electrification and 5 on the 4 on the hybrid side. There were a couple of actions, next slide please, that we weren't able to actually analyze because we lacked data for them, including on the electrification side, the industrial electrification. What does it take to cost out the electrification of 70% of industrial by 2050 was just beyond the capabilities in our data sets that we have right now. Something to put forward as a thing to refine and investigate more. The other one was on the hybrid side, 5% of fuel share from pyrolysis of biomass. We just didn't have adequate information on that, and something is still evolving. Same with 3 of the common actions. The transit buses were not there, and the 50% off-road vehicles was not there. We also included in the programs and regulations adopted or under development, like I mentioned before, the Recycling Modernization Act and also the DEQ landfill program. Next slide, please. So Again, this is another eye chart, but just to show you the detailed data that went into the model. So for each of the actions, we had all this kind of data that was provided to us by SSG's bigger model that we then downloaded from the SSG modeling into the scoring and ranking model. And so this data will be made available next week on the website. So it's the assumptions and the data that's went into SSG modeling that we then transferred into the scoring model. So we'll have a very lengthy, detailed spreadsheet with all this, all the assumptions and all the data points on our website sometime next week, hopefully. Next slide, please. In applying all of that data into these different ones, there were several of the evaluation criteria that were quantitative. So we had numbers from that big chart of detailed data that had numbers associated with them. And those are the ones that aren't circled. So they had number of jobs, the amount of reduction in air pollution from the COBRA model of EPA, and avoided health impacts, as well as energy transportation savings. Those things were quantifiable, as well as cost effectiveness and greenhouse gas emission reduction amounts. The ones that were qualitative, the ones where we had to apply a bit of professional judgment to, were the ones that are circled in red. So addressing health inequities, reducing other health impacts, technical and political feasibility, as well as implementation timing. And so when we applied that, next slide, please, we did that by each one of these sub-criteria and criteria has its own scoring bin, and each one of them had a possible 10 points associated with them, but then they were prorated according to the weightings that we had. So in the ones that were quantifiable were pretty easy. They were able to figure out how to put them into this scoring bin and get a result that allowed us to rank each action for that particular subcriteria from 1 to 10 and give them appropriate amount of points. For the ones that were qualitative, we actually used a scale of high, medium, low, and low. So we had 5 different metrics to assess them. So Zach and I went through each of the subcriteria and then went through each of the actions, both in the electrification and in the hybrid scenario, and then tried to use our professional judgment to put them into those categories from high to low. And then once we were done with it, we looked back and said, is this the right order for them to be scored, and moved them around accordingly based on what we ended up looking at the end, and then scoring them accordingly. So each one of them got either 10 or 8 or 5 or 6 or 4 or 2 points or none, depending on how they were evaluated using discussion and the information that we had and people that we had talked to. So that's how we ended up scoring each of the individual actions in the spreadsheet. Next slide, please. So in order to do that, we had to bring them all back together, another eye chart, which, and again, we'll be providing this model on the internet so that it'll be on the webpage, so you'll be able to look at it. And this brings back each one of those individual actions by each of the individual subcriteria and scored each of them on a 1 to 10 scale, and then weighted them over there on the blue weighted evaluation criteria scoring section to get to, over on the far right, what the total score was for each of the individual actions. So we did one of these for the electrification and one of them for the hybrid scenario. Again, 21 or so of the actions are common to both. So we were able to then get a scoring of each of the actions. Next slide, please. And in doing that, we were then able to rank order them based on different metrics. We rank ordered them based on, and this is for the electrification scenario, but there's a very similar chart for the hybrid scenario, again, with a lot of them being common, they're very similar. But this is the rank ordering of all the actions in the electrification scenario by how much greenhouse gas emissions they reduce. And you can see there's a pretty big range. Next slide, please. We also ranked them by how cost effective they were, or the MAC curve dollars per metric ton reduced. And you can see there's a pretty wide spread of results from that. Next slide, please. And we also evaluated, did the total score for the evaluation criteria and ranked them with all 6 of the criteria. And when we did that scoring spreadsheet, we were able to then get a final score for each one, from 85.5 points down to 26.1. So it's a pretty good spread amongst the group. And then finally, we were able to break out, next slide, please, as requested by the commission. If we just looked at the co-benefits, the 3 co-benefits of equity, health, and jobs and economic prosperity, how would they rank? And this is that this chart out of 45 points. It went from 40 points down to 8.8. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of data, and it took a lot of time to put it together. And it's very useful data, but how do we turn this data into something useful? And useful data is called information in my book. So while we need to implement all these actions to meet the accelerated goal, we may not be able to do them all at once. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that need to be allocated here and spent, and a lot of implementation needs to occur. And it's probably not likely that we'll be able to do every single one of these starting all at the same time, because there's 27 of them for the electrification and 25 for the hybrid scenario. So the purpose of the scoring and ranking is to help us prioritize the implementation of the actions. How should we then, if we can't do them all at once, how should we go about doing that? What should be the priority order of the actions for implementation? And really what the answer to that is that proverbial really bad answer that when I get, I always kind of cringe, which is it depends. And it depends on which lens you're looking through. So let me give you a couple, so next slide, please. So how you look at this and which way you want to look at it will determine what priority order you think we should have. So like, for instance, and it's not as simple as everything kind of aligns up. It unfortunately doesn't do that. So the action with the largest greenhouse gas reduction amount is not necessarily the most cost-effective one, nor is it the one with the highest evaluation criteria. So they're all 3 kind of apples, oranges, and kumquats. There are different ways of looking at it. Next slide, please. Let me give you an example. So this next series of 3 slides shows the actions. You've seen these before, but we're just pulling one out to show you what happens when you look at it from a different lens. This is looking at greenhouse gas reduction amount, how much greenhouse gas metric tons are reduced. So the green bar there is weatherization of existing residential homes by 2040, 100% of them. And this is when we look, it's third when we look at it from amount of greenhouse gas reduced. Next slide. But then when we change it and we look at it by cost effectiveness, it goes from third to 24th in terms of where it lands on the scale ranking in terms of cost effectiveness. And next slide, please. And then when we did the evaluation scoring, it actually moved from third to first. So you kind of got a bunch of different ways to look at this, and with different results. Traditionally it's been let's just do purely economic, but adding in evaluation criteria and changes the way that you prioritize it. Scoring model, the next slide, please, is that we were able to take all this data and create and figure out what changes when you look at it from one lens to a different lens. So for instance, when you look at it from going from which ones are the most cost effective dollars per metric ton reduced to the amount of greenhouse gases, it changes the order. And so what's the magnitude of the changes? And that's that column to the right, which is the colorful bar, which is actually called conditional formatting in Excel, which allows you to, the greater the amount of change in a positive direction, the darker the green, the greater the amount of change in a negative direction, the darker the red. And so the arrows are just kind of telling you which way it went. What's important about that, next slide, please, is that there were certain things that are actions that actually had big changes when you shifted from just looking at cost effectiveness to looking at how much their greenhouse gases amounts they make. And there were some that had big changes upward and some that have big changes downward, meaning that if you wanted to look at it from a perspective of the most important thing being greenhouse gas emission reduction amount, the weatherization and the rooftop solar of for instance, in electrification, were the ones that moved up a lot, and the ones that moved down a lot were typically kind of the transportation ones, and then also some of the smaller appliances. They're a relatively small amount of emission reduction, and so that's kind of the bottom line for this is when we shifted the lens from cost effectiveness to amount of greenhouse gas reductions, renewables and energy efficiency went up, and transportation and other thing and appliance kind of went down. Next slide, please. When we looked at it through a different lens and we shifted from looking at cost effectiveness to the evaluation criteria, as you saw from those other graphs, the order changed quite a bit, and you can see that there's a big difference in this one as well. Next slide, please. What happens in this scenario is that when you shift from just looking at the MAC curve or cost effectiveness to the evaluation criteria that we all developed together, again, you get to see sort of the same kind of analysis where the efficiency ones go up and the transportation ones and some of the other types of actions go down. Next slide, please. And then the third lens, of course, is shifting it from looking at it from the MAC curve perspective, but then looking at for just what the co-benefits only. Next slide, please. And that one had sort of similar results where a lot of the energy efficiency ones became more important or higher priorities, as well as the renewables ones, and some of the energy efficiency things went down depending on especially with regard to existing systems and some of the transportation ones based on our evaluation criteria co-benefits. And if you were to come up with a different set of criteria co-benefits, you'd get a different result, but this is what we chose to move forward with. Next slide, please. So what does all that mean? There are a set of, as we've described, a set of common actions that are in both scenarios. I grouped them here by color into their different food groups, the green ones being energy efficiency, the blue ones being transportation oriented. Food waste is kind of on its own, which is kind of an efficiency one, but and then the ones that are having to do with land use and building size are in another group. So it's kind of these four bigger categories of different types of actions. All of these common actions are in both scenarios. So next slide, please. So our thinking's right now, and we want to have a conversation about it, and we'll finish off this slide deck and we'll come back to these draft recommendations for discussion. But for the common actions, what we're thinking at this point is there's a lot of work, as Kathy mentioned, in order to get all the programs and regulations that we already adopted into place. There's another, on top of all that, we have this other set of actions that we have to take to implement the common actions from TIGR. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to do this. But most of the ones that are common actions tend to score high, have large greenhouse gas emission reductions, relatively speaking. They're they're more cost effective generally, and they have good co-benefits. And so a lot of these fall into that category of kind of no regrets actions. So our direct recommendation would to move all 21 of these forward and figure out how to get them implemented, and then actually have a discussion here a little bit today, but also next time, about how do we prioritize these depending on which lens you want to look through. Do you want to look through just the evaluation criteria scoring? Do you want to look through cost effectiveness? Do you want to look at greenhouse gas emissions? So what lens you want to look through determines how you want to prioritize these. So put a pin in that for right now, and we'll go on to the unique actions. Next slide, please. So the unique actions, we've seen this before. We had the 6 that were in electrification only and 5 that were in hybrid only. The 2 ones that are highlighted were the 2 that we didn't have sufficient data to be able to score and rank them. So we still need to do some more investigation into those, and that will be a recommendation in the report to get better and more data on those. But these actions, just like the other actions, don't tend to have this nice pattern of all lining up with the same when you look through different lenses. Next slide, please. So when you look at the electrification actions and the 4 or the 5 of them that are here, I highlighted them in green. So when you do the evaluation scoring, this is where they end up, with the rooftop being the one that's kind of unique of the unique ones, that is highly scored. And then actually the last 2 scores are the energy storage and residential residences, and switching out diesel backup with battery storage ended up scoring the least. Next slide, please. So then when you take it and you take and look where these are on how much greenhouse gas emissions they have, rooftop solar is again up at the top, but the other ones tend to be at the bottom, including the appliance ones. The making sure everybody has non-heating electric appliances, so not HVAC, not water heating, but other kinds of appliances, doesn't save you a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and relatively speaking. And so you can see how those rank out. And then, so the next slide, please. And then if you look at them from a from a cost effectiveness standpoint, how do they play out? The 4, there's actually 5. One of them, they're really small bars on the scale, but they tend to be on the less cost-effective side of the ledger here. So same with the hybrid unique ones. Next slide, please. So when you look at the hybrid unique actions, the 4 of them this is the same slide. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. This is when you just look at, sorry, good. That's right. I added one more. So this is when you just look at them with just based on the co-benefits. They don't tend to score very highly either. So this is just a subset of the 3: health, equity, and jobs and economic prosperity. So next slide, please. Same with the hybrid unique actions. There's 4 of those that we're able to. The ones that scored highly in the evaluation criteria, RNG and industrial renewable hydrogen, which is, some argue, is the highest and best use for hydrogen as opposed to using it for transportation or space heating or water heating, and versus fuel cells and injection into the pipeline didn't fare as well in the scoring. When you look at it, next slide, please, from a different perspective of how much greenhouse gas emissions they have, the RNG and the industrial do end up having a high amount of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The other one's not so much. And then the next slide, looking at the cost effectiveness, they all tend to be kind of in the middle of the pack. In terms of cost effectiveness. And then finally, if you look at them, next slide, please, based on only the 3 co-benefits, they tend to be on the left side of and not leading the pack in terms of co-benefits ranking. So what does all of that mean is a very good question. Next slide, please. So with regard to the unique actions, some of them do, they're not all in one boat. Some of them do kind of pretty well in the analysis. For instance, rooftop solar, RNG, and industrial renewable hydrogen actually do quite well in the analysis in most of the lenses that you look through, and others not so well, like residential energy storage, replacing diesel backup, and non-heating appliances being all electric, for instance, don't do exceptionally well in them. So where we are with these is that because it's kind of a mixed bag, our recommendation is moving them forward at this draft recommendation. It's moving them forward for further study, but also trying to figure out the ones that do well, how to implement them, and have them be part of the package of meeting the accelerated goal of 2030. Again, depending on how you prioritize those, and which ones to prioritize depends on which lens you look through. And we can come back to that conversation about which is the best way to do it. Just purely economics with cost effectiveness, or the evaluation scoring, which is more like of a balanced approach, or just purely on greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Alan,
So,
I have a quick question, if I could.
That was my last slide, Senator, so very good.
No, thanks. Just remind me what we're talking about when we're talking about non-heating appliances. Yeah.
When we basically, way to think about that, Senator, is so heating space and heating water. So if it's heating a building or heating the water used in the building, that's a heating appliance. So HVAC and water heaters, basically. Non-heating appliances are things like cooktops and stoves and fireplaces and things like that, so that or other appliances that gas fired clothes dryers, things like that are not basically heating water or heating the space.
Okay, great. And
the reason that is, Senator, is because most of the greenhouse gases from a house come from those 2 sources, which are space heating and water heating,
right,
like 80 to 90%.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That helps.
Thanks for jumping in, Senator Dembrow. First, and we will open it up for clarifying questions before our break, and then we'll come back and discuss the recommendations that were presented. But just wanted to put a point on the fact that this was an incredible amount of work, as you can see, and I think it will give us rich information that decision makers can use depending on which lens that they're most interested in. So I think in addition to thinking about how we rank actions, I think we'll also use it to help us define the different kinds of benefits of different actions from the different lenses that we looked at. So I just wanted to put a pin in that and thank Alan and Zach for the incredible amount of work that they did. So with that, I'll open it up
just to remind folks that all of the assumptions in the data will be put on the web, as well as this model. So those of you that are spreadsheet geeks will just have a ball with this, because it's a really cool spreadsheet.
Thanks, Alan. So maybe we can take the slides down for just a minute, and then any questions, unless people have questions about the slides, maybe we should keep them up. So commissioners, do you have other clarifying questions or comments on any of the approach that Alan and Zach took? I think there was one modification to our proposed methodology around the alleviating energy burden, which got kind of less weight than we had originally intended. So if people have any concerns around that, I thought Alan did a nice job of explaining it, but certainly love to hear if folks had any concerns about that or any clarifying questions.
This is Commissioner Jackson. I saw that Commissioner Gabriella, she had her hand up, so I want to make sure I let her speak first and then I'll go after.
Oh, no, I was using the clapping or amazing emoji for that amazing work that the team did. So thank you, though.
Okay, then somebody else had a hand up.
Commissioner Apter.
Applause, Gabriella.
Okay, I think she was ahead of me, so let me just wait my turn here.
Oh, I think you should feel free to go ahead. I raised my hand after you started speaking.
Okay, well, let me, well, first, let me begin by Alan, Zach, and anybody else who was involved in the preparation of this analysis. This was a lot of work. As we've gone through this, I've wondered how we were going to put kind of the qualitative and quantitative, information together, and this was really well done. So I really appreciate it, and the presentation was really easy to follow and broken down very specifically. So for me, that was really good. And then getting us to this unique actions for a draft recommendation. So being that you went through it so thoroughly, I'll stay away from all that detail. But the center asked a little bit about the non-heating appliances, which I also had a question about. So with that answered that. But I also had a question about it said that some of the actions do well, which is rooftop solar. I was really surprised to see that, although I'm happy to see that. Can you talk a little bit about why that makes sense, given the fact that sometimes that's rooftop solar, when you're collecting it during, the times when you're not using it, then you need some energy storage. And I noticed that you put others do not residential energy storage. So I was wondering how those tie together.
Yeah, good question, Commissioner. First of all, let me preface that each one of these actions is it has its own little story about them. And they're all may or may not be what you think they are, but they all have what we decided we could model. And so they all have suffer from a little bit of the same thing, which is they have a limited amount of data associated with them. And I just wanted to say that the impacts that they have in the model are the direct impacts they have. So like, for instance, when we modeled 25% more density in cities, it was the direct impact is on the energy use in the buildings got reduced. And therefore it had an impact that way. But when you do densification, there's secondary and tertiary impacts, like it makes it a 20-minute neighborhood, and not to be outdone by Portland, Eugene decided to do 19-minute neighborhoods. And that makes you allow to be able to walk around more and not use your cars. And there's a much smaller carbon footprint associated with that. But that's a secondary and tertiary one that's not captured in this modeling. So we tried to stick to just the direct impacts. That would have been in the, as we're fond of saying, that was in the $1 million grant that we didn't get to be able to do that. So with regard to the rooftop solar, that was basically replicating the solar plus storage program that we have right now, using that we have to pay an incentive to get people to do solar rooftops. So the cost associated with that was basically the incentive associated with it and moving that forward, but also the savings. So it was using the successful solar plus storage program that we're running right now. And by the way, there's a bill to extend that program, which would basically help do this in the next legislature. And the uptake of the solar part of the solar plus storage has been pretty modest. And it's pretty expensive. So while solar has seen a dramatic drop in the cost of installation, I know I put solar in my house for like $2 $1.78 a kilowatt, which is incredibly cheap. 5 years ago, it would have been $6-8 a kilowatt. So it's dropped dramatically. And while energy storage batteries is coming on strong, it's not there yet. It's still on the cost decline curve. But that cost decline curve is supposed to, we're using today's dollars. We didn't project out that that would decline over time. So over time, that will become more of an effective strategy. But in the short term, it's still pretty expensive, relatively speaking, to do energy storage batteries. Did I answer your question?
Commissioner After?
Thank you. Want to echo others' gratitude and applause for Alan and Zach and Kathy, all the incredible work that went into this. I can only imagine the many hours of analysis and work to synthesize it into this presentation. So thank you so much.
It gave me COVID.
What was that? It gave you COVID?
It gave me COVID.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I hope you are feeling recovered, Alan. I just wanted to ask a question and or just clarify and confirm. I know we had previous conversations in past meetings around health considerations and co-benefits, and I wanted to confirm that indoor air quality was not included in the health co-benefits analysis.
It was.
It was
part of the analysis associated with Zach. You can help me out here. It was part of the health benefits associated with reduced other health risks, which was one of the sub-criteria, and so we used that as one of the definitions of that. Is how does it impact indoor air quality? So that was incorporated. So those things that improved indoor air quality got better scores, and things that didn't got lower scores.
Yep. And it was also that health criteria was then also used in the equity criteria. So in some ways there was a little more emphasis on the health benefits through the criteria.
okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I was a little surprised that the non-heating appliances, the all-electric, didn't score as well given the health benefits associated with improved indoor air quality. But glad to know it was incorporated, and happy to take any other discussion around that offline. Yeah.
I think it didn't score well when you look at it. It doesn't create a lot of greenhouse gas emission reduction, so it didn't score well from that lens. It's not that cost effective, so it didn't score very well from that lens. And when you did the balanced overall evaluation criteria score, it got bogged down because of those two things. But when you just looked at the three co-benefits, it actually moved up in prioritization. Go back. Yeah, so it moved up in terms of where it was. It wasn't dead last anymore. Keep going. There you go. So yeah, they moved up to, where are they?
Yeah, I think this bar didn't get highlighted in green.
Oh yeah,
but it did move up.
Got it.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks for reviewing that.
Right. So it moved up from really towards the bottom to in the top quartile.
Got it.
So it did reflect what you were thinking about, Commissioner.
And was for RNG, was that also part of the analysis?
Well, so we assume that from a health perspective, it was basically just substituting one part of natural gas to another source of natural gas. It's just, where was it sourced? Was it renewable natural gas or was it fossil natural gas? Essentially the same amount of indoor air constituents, and so it got basically it got zero for was at the low end of the score in terms of improving indoor air quality.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Zach.
Any other clarifying questions for commissioners?
I have a question, Commissioner Reitman, and again, yeah, very impressive work. But my question is, how do we account for, as we electrify, like, for example, today we're producing neither wind nor solar where I am. And so I assume that, there's a lot of water going through the dams, but are we having to fire up fossil fuel generators? And is that taken into consideration?
Not in this analysis, but in the grander scheme of things, that gets incorporated into the implementation of the CPP and HB 2021. And as we go from where we are now to 100% renewable energy, Commissioner Reitman, that becomes less and less of an issue over time because of HB 2021 and also any of the gas, and also HB 2021 prohibited the siting of any new gas plants. So you can't have a natural gas fired electricity plant in Oregon anymore. You can still import it, but you can't build one. And with the CPP, it also reduces the carbon intensity of natural gas use over time as well. So over time, all those things, because of those two programs, and of course, those are incorporated into being able to meet our targets by 2035 through those programs and regulations that we've already adopted.
Commissioner Reitman, one of the meetings that I think we had before you were on the commission, if I'm correct, we did kind of discuss some of the key things that need to happen to keep our energy system reliable, and that's probably a topic that would be good for us to put on our agenda, in the near term to go back. But regional markets and storage certainly being two critical, as well as transmission being the three key things that need to come along with.
Sure, it has to be in parallel to all of this.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. Any other clarifying questions from commissioners?
Suzanne with ODOT. I'm not seeing light duty electrification on this slide. Could you move to a slide that would have the light duty sector? I'm assuming that was in your calculations.
Yeah, that's not part of the actions that are in TIGR. Those are the electrification of light duty sector are part of the programs and regulations adopted or under development. The under development one is specifically related to Advanced Clean Cars 2, which the EQC is taking up currently to require 100% of new sales of cars to be EVs by 2035. So it changes the gradual slope upward to a hockey stick graph. And so those are incorporated in the initial scenario with regard to as part of those programs and regulations that the state has already adopted. So we didn't incorporate them in here because they're in that part of it.
Alan, a question for me. When we were talking about the solar and where it ranked out, you said we do have a program and there is legislation to propose extending the program. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. It actually sunsets and it runs out of appropriations. By the way, when we did the first, we're in the second round of that program. The first round, the money went extremely fast, and we say same thing happened in the second round. There's so much pent up demand for the residential solar because predominantly this price has dropped, and then when you link it up with batteries and you get an incentive for it, for a lot of people, it's the right thing to do. But both of that program sunsets and the funding goes away. So the bill to move it forward is to extend it and reappropriate money for it. If I might, one more thing about for Suzanne on the light duty vehicles for EV sales. Once you get to 100% EV sales by 2035, there isn't a lot more to do in the light duty sector. So that gets pretty much handled by the Advanced Clean Cars 2, but also the Clean Fuels program and the reduction in the carbon intensity of fuels, and then on the medium duty, heavy duty, advanced trucks rule and other kinds of things that the DEQ's been doing have really done a really good job of reducing the emissions from those sectors as well. So those things majority of those things get handled in the programs and regulations already adopted portion that allow us to meet our goal by 2035 through what we've already done. So good work on us. We just have to implement it. Like Commissioner McDonald said, it's a heck of a heavy lift with a lot of details and a lot of work and funding that required to actually make sure that we end up doing that.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why I asked when I did, is when you're starting to look at costs and priorities, I guess some things that still have a huge dollar cost and a lot of individual action don't show up there. It's not criticism, it's just a comment that
it shows up
was kind of looking for that body of work and it doesn't show up in those charts. Right. Thanks.
What gets in this grouping after all that gets done, what's left is the car share increases, the mode shift to passenger rail, the shift from medium duty to light duty, and then the off-road vehicles and the micromobility, and also the modes. So all of those things get those are the things that are left over to do that are incorporated in this analysis.
And just a reminder, in terms of the framework for the roadmap, our first recommendation or grouping of recommendations are around making sure we get effective implementation of the existing programs. So we'll try and do a good job of emphasizing the importance of those programs under that part of our framework of recommendations.
Right, probably recommendation 1.
Yeah, it is recommendation. Absolutely. Okay, any last clarifying questions? We are going to come back and discuss this and discuss the draft recommendations that were presented after we take public comment. So just give another, if anybody has any last clarifying questions. Seeing none. If you haven't, let us know that you want to provide public testimony, do so right away. Linda will be taking stock during the break of how many people want to testify, and that will help us guide our time during the public comment period. Alan, you did a great job of getting us back on track time-wise and covering an incredible amount of information. So that's good news. But please do let us know if you want to testify, and then we'll come back at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock and take public comment. Anything else, Zach or Linda, for the good of the order before we go to break?
No, at this time we don't have anyone signed up, so
okay.
Just so you know.
I did see a hand from Tim Miller pop up. I think that was to maybe get in the queue, or I don't know if Tim had a question.
There we are. Okay, we have one. Good deal.
And I also thought I saw Eric Strid's interest in testifying, but I'm not positive. So,
thank you very much.
Double check on that. All right. And with that, we'll go to break. I'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Hey, Zach.
Yes.
Can you pull that slide? That's the common recommendations one, or duplicate it and put it next to this unique one so they can be right together, so we can use them after the break to have a conversation about the recommendations and the prioritization efforts?
Sure. Yep. I'll work
You
on
know,
it.
you know what I'm talking about? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Great job, you guys. That was really something.
Thanks.
It was awesome.
It was easy.
Yeah, I bet.
Very nice job.
Yeah, it was crazy good. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Linda.
You and I are back. Always. Yeah, that was something, that presentation. Cool.
I'd like to reconvene the December 16th meeting of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. If people could go back on video so that we know you're back. We'll get started in just a minute. I think about almost all of the commission members are back. Just a couple that aren't on video yet. If you could turn your video back on so we know you're back. You have it. I think we're close to critical mass. So any additional people sign up to want to testify? I have Tim Miller, Pat Delaquille, and then Eric Strid put comments in chat. So I don't know if he wants to testify as well or not.
That's who I have also.
Okay, great. Well, then you people can take up to 3 minutes to testify.
Tim, we'll start with you.
All right. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
We can. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair McDonald and commissioners and everyone else who's listening. Thanks for a chance to chime in on this. I just want to echo first the comments of appreciation, the work that Alan and Zach and Kathy and the whole team did, the analysis team, Chair McDonald and everyone. It really, to me, moves us toward a real plan. And I think, Alan, you demonstrated the challenges of really trying to come at this thing in different ways to merge these different analyses. Thank you. I think I have a mix of questions and comments. There are three buckets. First one is, I was pretty surprised to see under the lack of data bucket, the notion of going to 100% EVs. I would think that'd be one of the things we would have the most data or analysis or understanding of. And while it may be taken up in a different conversation around clean cars, it would be so helpful to have that stacked up against all these other strategies. The fact that it's in a different conversation actually makes it more important that it gets stacked up against these other things so that we all have a shared language and understanding of the importance of these different things. So anyway, I was a little surprised about that, and it would be great to have it in there. Number two, unless you want to respond one by one, probably should I stack them all up here, Chair?
Sure. Yes,
okay.
Please.
Okay. Number two, Alan, I thought you did a great job of describing the issue around reducing, or how you reduce the weight of alleviating energy burden. But sometimes, as you know, when you're dealing with these kinds of analyses, if you come across a problem like that where, gosh, this one really seems to skew everything else, sometimes that points to a problem in methodology more than just the fact that this thing is too strong. So just weakening it may not be the right solution. And I wonder if you thought of other solutions, because alleviating energy burden is certainly very important from an equity standpoint, and weakening it may not be the right approach. One other approach might be to say, well, okay, so what about all those criteria that don't touch this one? Maybe we need to think of an industrial corollary, or a different job creation thing, or a different economic resilience criteria that applies to the other ones. Something that offsets it but doesn't just water it down. Might be worth considering. The third one is I appreciated your conversation with Commissioner Apter about indoor air quality. And I wonder if you could speak to how the professional judgment was applied to that one. We all know that there are more and more studies about the impacts of stoves on indoor air quality, especially on kids. I would think that might give it a little extra heft. And I wonder if in residential energy efficiency, you factored in all the benefits of the indoor air sealing or the air sealing that goes along with doing good energy efficiency and how that reduces nasty particulates from coming up from crawl spaces and things and all the other IAQ benefits. So if you could speak to how you evaluated IAQ, and then finally related to this on stovetops, gosh, if you electrify the heating in a house and the water heating, now you're left with a stovetop. That's all the gas is doing. Maintaining the whole gas system and all the infrastructure and all the maintenance to do that just so somebody can have a gas stove, that's a heck of a lot of cost if you factor in that way to carry for that one for a stove. So I would think that the cost analysis would show that somehow. I get that if you're a gas utility, it's pretty nice to keep that customer hooked up and all the infrastructure and all the rate base that goes with it, but that's a heck of a lot of a cost from a societal standpoint. I wonder if you could speak to that. So those are my three, maybe 3.5 comments / questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate the comments and really good specifics. That Alan, do you want to try and respond to?
Yeah. Thanks for paying attention to the slides close enough to find the one error I had in the slides, which is that lack of data shouldn't have included the new EV sales. It should have been, that shouldn't have been in there. It's actually, it was on a list of things that we moved that were identified for in the first part of our analysis that showed that we're on track to meet goals. So we do have gobs and gobs of data on EVs, and we know, and the folks that are Corey and Wynn and other folks can talk about the different clean fuels program, but also the EV rebates that are online if anybody has any questions about that. But we also have an incredibly cool Go Electric website with an EV dashboard, which goes back and shows you where all the EVs are, and goes back to the very first EV registered in Oregon, which I think is a Dodge van that was a conversion back in 1973 or something like that. It's an incredibly detailed amount of data on it. So thanks for catching that. On the indoor air quality,
Alan, sticking with that, I think I heard two things, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong. One was lack of information. The other was kind of where it's sitting, and that we didn't do the evaluation criteria of all the existing programs to compare them to one another. So I think that was a second element of that.
Yeah.
Of that question.
Good. Yeah. So for all of those, I think it's a baker dozen programs, plus the Recycling Modernization Act landfill program. All those programs that we considered already adopted or under development, like the Advanced Clean Cars 2, which gets us to 100% EV sales. We did not do a detailed analysis on the cost associated with those or the benefits associated with those that we did for each of these actions. Because we weren't trying to do that. What we were looking at was how much greenhouse gas emissions would they account for, and in each of those programs specifically, and then also the remainder for the CPP and for the HB 2021. We just assumed, we're going to get these reductions in greenhouse gases from the electricity sector down to 0 by 2045, and so we put those into the model to see if we would all those totaled up to getting at meeting the target the goal by 2035, and indeed they do. But we didn't venture into trying to do the cost benefit analysis on each of them. We just identified the greenhouse gas emission reduction amounts for each of them. What we did for all the actions in this one.
Tim, go ahead, Tim. or sorry, I think Alan, you said something. So Tim, did that get at what you were asking or the point you were trying to make about?
I think, yeah, it did. That was very helpful on the EVs. I think I wasn't aware that we were counting advanced clean cars too to be in the bag, but that's fantastic if we are. It would still be nice to know about the cost effectiveness of it in this paradigm and the co-benefits of it in terms of the pollutants in our particularly impacted neighborhoods. But I get that you can't analyze everything, so understood.
Yeah, that was
Okay,
in
that-
the $1.5
Alan,
million.
I think the second issue was the way you approached energy burden, and did you think of other approaches that you could have taken? Thinking about some of the example that Tim gave.
Yeah. So with regard to energy burden, it is in the biennial energy report, BRRR, the one we did in 2018 and the one we did in 2020. We have two sections on them, and if you're interested in Tim and learning more about that topic, I would commend those two articles for you. One of the key takeaways from both of those things is we don't have a lot of data on this. The data that we did get on energy burden was from Oregon Housing, and we have a graphic that shows energy burden by county, and we in particular just don't have really good statistics and information and data on that. That is going to be one of our recommendations, that we bolster that capability to be able to do that, because we just can't look at it without enough data. It's especially true on the transportation side. We've got very lacking a lot of information on that. Well, the only metric we had available to us for this particular one related to these actions that we have here, which are about 35, was the modeling that SSG did in terms of, they looked at household energy cost as a percent of income, and they turned on the action and saw what would happen by 2050 and how much their income, or how much of their cost dropped relative to their income. And that was how they calculated reduction in energy burden. And we only had that for households. So we didn't have that for businesses, because we don't calculate that for business or industry, and it doesn't even affect the transportation measure. So it turned out not to be a very good metric to compare, because we only have a limited amount of data.
Well, Alan, I think Tim's point was, he understood the rationale that you took, but was just wondering if a different method might have been better, like what might be missing that could counterbalance that data gap in other sectors. So what I would suggest is maybe we just, after the meeting, maybe you and Zach and I can just talk through that decision and come back at the next meeting if we have a different view or can think of a different way of approaching it.
Yeah, we did have that conversation. We didn't come up with anything brilliant, but yeah, we can noodle on that some more.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The last issue, which was indoor air quality. So the level of reduced health risks in the health scoring, and also the was one metric, and the other metric was in the equity benefits, which is the level of addressing health inequalities. In both of those metrics, they were qualitative, so they had the high, medium, low, low, and you got 10 points for high, and low got 2, and none got 0. Some of them got 0. In both those instances, the appliance ones got high, and so they got the maximum amount of points in each of those two sub-criteria. So it was taken into consideration that indoor air quality gets improved by that. The reason it doesn't show up in the scoring very as much as maybe you'd like is that those two particular sub-criteria have a total of 7.5 and 6.5 points out of 100. And so even if you maxed out, it doesn't move the scale very much, and it doesn't move you, it moves you a little bit, but not a dramatic amount, because they're not the way that the commission weighted the evaluation criteria. Most of that weighting, a third of it, almost 29 points out of 100, went to greenhouse gas emission reduction amounts, another 15 to cost effectiveness, and then the rest were associated with the other co-benefits and evaluation criteria. So it's a factor of how the weighting was applied, and the fact that they do have that impact does move the dial a little bit, but only a little bit. That makes sense.
That was very helpful. Yeah. I maybe that did maybe show up in the chart where you showed that if you just look at the co-benefits, that thing moves way up. But when you look at the overall analysis, and then just the 3.5 comment or question was, when you're thinking about costs of a stove, and you got to maintain a whole system of natural gas distribution for one appliance in a bunch of homes. Is that part of the cost analysis?
No,
that's a big burden for
not.
one device to carry.
Yeah, all of those ancillary costs associated with all of these different things. So for instance, if we're bringing on new renewables, we need new infrastructure, that cost is not in here. New pipeline cost, or just the maintenance of all of that, is not incorporated. We just limited this analysis to the cost associated with the direct implementation of the particular action. Whether or not it's cost effective for Northwest Natural to put a pipe or a connection to just have someone have a stove is a business question I'd pose to Northwest Natural.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
It's a really good point and good question for us to consider as we think about the recommendations. Thank you, Tim. Pat Delaquil.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, my name is Pat Delaquil. I am an energy systems modeler and climate policy analyst. And I really want to commend Alan and Zach for the analysis they did on the model results. I think the perspective of looking at it from those three different directions was very insightful. I think it helps to clarify what kind of are the priority policies that we really need to suss out here. My comments, and I've looked at the draft report, and I really support the recommendations there. I was surprised by the comments with regards to embedded carbon in materials. And what we know is that we can make many of these materials, but they're simply more expensive than the regular materials. And so they need a niche market. They need a way to expand their capacity so they can bring the costs down over time. And so one of the things that it seems to me as an important policy is for the state to use its purchasing power to create niche markets for these low carbon materials. And I hope that kind of a policy can be considered as part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate your comments. And Eric, do you want to just take your comments offline, or did you want to speak to the commission? Hearing none. I think we can go into this. Oh, sorry.
I don't see Eric on the attendees list anymore.
Oh, okay. Okay. We'll take his comments offline. So with that, we can go back to the slides, and discuss the recommendations that staff have made. Zach, are you bringing the slides up? Yeah, great. Thank you.
It's tough being in an instant gratification world when things aren't.
Sorry about that. Should be up now.
Great.
So we have,
And then
there are two slides. That I think, Alan, you were hoping to have here. So the common actions draft recommendation related summary, and then the unique actions draft recommendation related summary.
start with this one.
Yeah, if I could add just two things to the last two bullets on each of the slides, just a little bit more clarity for maybe stimulate some conversation within the commission and get some good discussion going and some good feedback. So by moving forward to figure out implementation, so a lot of these actions are some of them are well understood and some of them are not. And they have they need more investigation and they need more data, but they also need to move on to the implementation phase. So what we've been talking about so far within Tigger is the what should we do and how much are we going to get of it? The how of what we do it is the next phase. And that's where what we're kind of recommending here, which is move it on to the how phase from the what and how much phase. So how you do it, how you implement it, how do you do the funding, who's going to be the purveyors of it, who's going to be the project manager of it, where agency does it land in, is it going to be utilities, what are the equity considerations? Commissioner Magnara often talks about how you do things really impacts the way you do it. And so that question about moving them forward into an implementation phase is what that really means. So, and especially for those actions we already know how to do, like solar rooftops, for instance, or weatherization, we just need to do more of it, right? And then secondly, on the prioritization discussion, so the question there is, does that make sense for the commission to move these forward? The second one related to prioritization discussion is this conversation about lenses. So you've got different ways of looking at these actions. One is the traditional way, which is just cost effectiveness, which is dollars per metric ton reduced. And if you were a least cost planning person, you would say, yep, that's how we do it. And you go from most cost effective to least cost effective and do it in that order. And so plan done. But we wanted to look at it from different perspective as well. So these other lenses end up giving you a different priority order. So the greenhouse gas emissions we showed you that it shows different priorities if you just want to focus on how much you're going to get. So if you Zach, if you could bring up one of those graphics of the greenhouse gas emissions ranking, like 41 or something like that. If you just focused on those upper tier of actions, you'd get most of the greenhouse gas emissions. The bottom third of the actions don't contribute a lot, but they're might be important for other reasons. So you might think about it differently from that perspective. And then finally, when we pull it all together, the scoring, the evaluation scoring is an attempt to kind of pull all those things together to try to get, okay, cost effectiveness is important, greenhouse gas amount reductions is important, but all these other things, these co-benefits and risk and uncertainty is also important. And so by doing this scoring, using the evaluation criteria, you kind of get a balanced approach to taking into consideration all of those things based on your conversation about how much value or weighting should we put on each of these. So that creates that more balanced accounting of the lens to look at, and you might say, well, that's the right way to look at things in terms of the prioritization, because it takes into consideration all of it. You might argue whether or not the percentage, the weightings are correct. You know, maybe some people would say, well, cost effectiveness isn't weighted high enough in that analysis, but that's easy to change, and the model's set up so you can do it kind of like that. But so the question is, how much weighting should we put on these three basic or three different kinds of lenses that we put in terms of trying to get at which ones would be the higher priority ones, given that we can't do everything at once? How do you decide what should go first? That's a yes/no question.
Alan, thank you for recapping that information for us. Before we dive into trying to answer this one, or as part of our discussion of this one, you focused a lot on the unique actions in the two scenarios when we were looking at what was moving where. And in the unique actions recommendations, we were kind of saying some of these should go to new studies. We'll take up that question later. We didn't really look at what was moving around a lot in the common actions, but I imagine that there are probably some things in the common actions that either we don't have enough information about, or that, you know, moved around a lot, that might also be considered as something that you would put into that research bucket. And so, you know, my initial reaction was, and I think as we've talked about as kind of a steering committee, is, you know, it seems like a no-brainer to go along with all of the things that are in the common actions. But with that picture you just painted of how we should be thinking about this, and the way that you've characterized in the draft recommendation for the unique actions, it just raises a question for me if we should maybe have a draft recommendation on moving forward with all of the common actions, or we should kind of take a closer look at that and pull out whatever ones we think should be in a bucket of kind of need more information about this. So I don't know, I mean, maybe there aren't any like that in the common actions, but I just wanted to raise that question with you before I weigh in on the draft recommendation.
Yeah, when we were talking about this before, what we separated out on purpose the common actions from the unique actions, because they're different and they need to be treated differently. And to some degree, what it says on the screen here, you know, a lot of them, not all of them, but they tended to score higher. Large greenhouse gas emissions for most, they're cost effective, now could go benefits, and they end up kind of most of them being put into that no regrets to move forward. So yeah, people have said no brainer on all of them. I guess you could look at it like that. We didn't parse it out down to, well, maybe not this one, because the bottom line is you need to do all of these actions to meet the accelerated goal. You don't get to like not do one or two of them, especially if they're big, because then you don't meet the goal. So you have to do all of them. So how do you move them forward, in what order is really the question. And Zach, you might want to go to the next slide, or back to the other slide. So for when we separated out the unique actions, some do well in the analysis, you know, like rooftop solar and other ones in the scoring analysis, for instance. They did well, and others didn't, because they're just not big bang for the buck kind of things like the appliances. They don't use a lot of gas, so they don't get you a lot of benefit. Like cooktops and fireplaces, I think the estimate when they studied this, Good Company studied this in Eugene, I think it was less than 4% of the overall gas emissions come from non-heating appliances. So 96% of it comes from space heating and water heating. So there's the focus. So it's not, and some of the storage ones are kind of on the expensive side. So whether or not we want to parse out any of these to not forward or just forward all of them or forward only the electrification ones, for instance, or something like that, is a conversation to be had. And this is the appropriate time for that to occur. And so we can help develop the draft recommendations for next meeting of the commission. And how do you prioritize that?
Absolutely. I completely understand that. I'm just, we've treated the two sets a little differently. It seems like we should, to some extent, have a consistent approach. If there are some things that we think aren't quite ready for prime time in the common actions, categorize or describe those a little differently, like we would maybe with some of these unique actions. Would seem appropriate to me. I mean, I certainly think if they're common to both, it makes sense for them to be advanced. But if this second way of looking at it, thinking about kind of what's ready for what type of action, I think is also an appropriate way to look at both sets of actions. So yeah, I would, I guess I would, going back to the earlier slide, I would tend to say tentatively move all of them forward, but go, take a closer look at the changes in the rankings now that we have that great analysis that you've done, and see if there are some that might fall out one way or another in terms of maybe needing some additional attention before we think about how to move forward on implementation. So I would say tentative approval with a little follow-on work to take a little closer look at the common actions.
Yeah, an interesting way to parse that out a little bit more is related to the risk and uncertainty criteria that we had, where we broke that down into technical feasibility, political feasibility, and how much lead time or how much implementation time they have. The longer it takes, the higher the risk. And there, within that scoring metric, for those scoring bins, there's some common themes about the things that had pretty low technical and political feasibility and took a long time to implement that and most of them are associated with the unique actions. And so that might be a way to actually look at them and parse it out a little bit more and say, okay, we need to do all this, but given the technical, political, and implementation timing, these are not the highest priority ones to work on.
And will the risk metric be included in the information we post, or risk and uncertainty? Okay, great. So I think we'll see all the spreadsheet will have scoring bins for each of and every one of the sub criteria, and you can see exactly how we rated them and what the criteria or what the basis for those recommendations were, what we were looking at. Great. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it was one of the elements that I think the commission thought was pretty important for us to look at, but yeah, we didn't really talk about it today. So, with that kind of backdrop, that helps me think about this. Are there other commissioners that want to weigh in?
This is Commissioner Jackson, if I could.
Great. Commissioner Jackson.
As you kind of showed us the different opportunities that we have here, I think you really got to the kind of meat of everything is, after we see all that information is, how do we actually move forward? How do we get things done, things moving? I really like that you mentioned about the kind of those that are uncertain, have risks that we still need to evaluate. I definitely think we should kind of figure that out separately. But in the interest of trying to figure out which of them have the biggest GHG emissions reductions, I think we really want to prioritize those. And then of those, looking at which, of course, have the are most cost effective and have co-benefits, right? We're trying to like narrow into the, you know, you can't do it all at once or you do nothing. So to me, it's like, okay, how do we get the best benefit? And within those that are labeled as having the biggest outcome, which of those are most cost effective? So it starts really prioritizing an order of what makes sense. Because unless we really can demonstrate a path towards significant action, you know, it'd be concerned that we would focus on some of the less GHG emissions just because they're easier. But then you look at the timeline in which we want to get things done, and we, you know, you've got the big elephant still to get to. And I think you can underestimate how much even small GHG reductions can take. So it's like, why don't we focus on how we're kind of really tasked to make the greatest impact, you know, within a time frame. So I know it's easier said than done, but I just, it's like, how do you start? And it's like, well, at some point we just have to decide and start and going, what gives us the biggest impact? How many of them are there? And then how do we start prioritizing that? So I don't know if that's helpful or it's just kind of, but I just feel the approach you gave us is pretty logical, but definitely I'm focused on really, how do we have a plan to get it done? Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Jackson. Senator Dembro?
We'll kind of respond to that real quick, because my experience with having years of doing program implementation and resource development over the decades is that the big things, the small things take almost as much time as the big things. So like, you know, if you're going to build a 2 megawatt power plant, it takes exactly the same steps and the same amount of time as it does do 100 megawatts. Yeah. So that also plays into it. So if you're focusing on, like you said, Commissioner, the things that are really small, that might be important, but they take a lot of effort. And the ones that are really big take the same amount of effort. Let's move on those forward at a higher priority. That makes sense to me too.
Senator Dembro.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, my question is very much aligned with the commissioners. You know, just in terms of, you know, thinking of the implementation and the implementation challenges, you know, thinking of rooftop solar, for example, you know, we've talked about, you know, the challenge of how do you align adding rooftop solar with adding storage, right? And, you know, the question, you know, some people would ask is, does it make sense for us to, you know, dramatically increase rooftop solar before we have the storage capacity, you know, to make the most use of it? And, you know, I'm wondering how you're thinking about, for example, those levers. And, you know, with rooftop solar, remind me if the analysis kind of separates between residential rooftop or, you know, public buildings or commercial or, you know, what we often refer to as community solar sorts of, you know, rooftop projects. And so I guess, you know, my question as well is around sort of the implementation details of what the prioritization would mean.
That's good.
Yeah, two comments on that. You know, when the solar plus storage program was developed and designed, actually I helped design it, the heavy burden of that program's success is carried by the solar part. The storage is more expensive and more niche right now, and so it's easy to tag it on to a solar program. If you've already got all that infrastructure in place and you already got all the approval processes and implementation process in place, adding storage into it is easy. And we got some solar projects. And to the point, Senator, it allows you to put solar on an existing, put storage on an existing solar project. So it can be kind of standalone as well. It doesn't have to be together. So it can be, as time goes by, that becomes bigger and bigger as the cost of those drop and they become better technology. On terms of that particular project, rooftop solar was on residential buildings, all types of residential buildings, but not commercial. As is because it's patterned after the solar plus storage program.
But couldn't we look at solar on other types of buildings?
Yeah, we had another program where it gets integrated into the building structures, which would be more of a commercial side, and that's more expensive and a little less of a really good action, for instance, I think.
How far out is storage? I mean, I've heard people talk about using water heaters as storage, and that seemed pretty imminent. Not recognizing that's not the whole 9 yards of storage, but
yeah, there is a burr in the 2022 burr, a whole section on energy storage and all the different functions. And so if you're interested in that, I'd commend that article to you. But what we're really focused in on storage on these actions was batteries, and having them be able to be to take grid energy during off peak and then use it on peak, that, depending on the grid energy, may or may not actually reduce any emissions. It makes it more renewable if the batteries get filled up with renewables and avoid fossil fuel. A colleague of mine, Jessica Rikers, who works for me, described storage or batteries as the tofu of the energy world. Kind of takes on whatever flavor you put in it, right? And so if it's renewable energy that fills the batteries, then it's renewable. If it's fossil fuel, then it's fossil fuel. So we have to be careful about how we do that. That's why connecting the solar to the storage actually makes a lot of sense, because then it gets fed by the solar system, and it's a renewable energy storage then.
Commissioner Apter, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I want to again echo Commissioner Jackson's comments, and I will continue to think through how best to synthesize this information. Yeah, it's a lot to navigate, but I do agree with and want to echo Commissioner Jackson's thoughts, and try to be helpful in thinking through what that looks like in reality. I also just wanted to raise up, I should have mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but looking at the co-benefits around risk and uncertainty, I was noting that political feasibility has a pretty high weight there, 40%. And when we're thinking about rating these actions, I'm not sure if that makes the most sense to have that high of a rating. I don't know if it's possible to adjust that. I do recognize risk and uncertainty is the lowest weighting of the various evaluation criteria, but since, and I think we've talked about this in previous meetings, that score in particular is relatively subjective as opposed to the others, as we're trying to prioritize and really emphasize where we have the greatest opportunity for greenhouse gas emission reductions. I don't know if we want to presume political feasibility as part of that prioritization effort.
My understanding is that it's relatively easy to change a weighting factor in the spreadsheet. Is that right, Alan?
Yeah, it's very simple actually to do. And I would just point out that it's 40%, 11 points. So it's 4.4 points for technical, 4.4 points for political feasibility, and 2.2 points for implementation timing. All of that relative to greenhouse gas emission reductions, which is 29 points. So 4 points versus 29 points. So it's that kind of the relative scale. And the commission chose to actually downscale the risk and uncertainty allocation of points.
Which I
And
wonder if
you
that
move
was the best decision. I think that, you know, like if I were gonna move forward with a recommendation of how we use this information, I would, I agree that thinking about greenhouse gas in terms of the prioritization, but I think if you go to the next slide, that concept of, you know, these things move around a lot, and so we should put them into a future study. That doesn't really work for me. Rooftop solar seems like we don't need to do more study. It seems like it's something that's happening, and you know, we're not, you know, I wish we would be so wildly successful that it wouldn't make sense to do it yet because storage isn't quite ready yet. But I think, you know, I worry a little bit about us sending a message that we don't think rooftop solar is a good investment for the state at this time if we put it into that other category. What I would, just as an example from this list, what I would prefer us to look at is that risk and uncertainty as the way to kind of figure out what we put into more research and study, rather than, you know, using something moving around. So, and then broadly, I would say I think we should do that for all the actions, and then if there are a couple in the common actions that follow that have some, you know, are not ready yet for prime time, and are technically infeasible at this point, then, you know, that would be a better way from my perspective to move things into the study and category rather than using just something that moves around a lot.
Yeah, we can definitely parse out which of the things need more study and separate those out based on the risk and uncertainty criteria, as opposed to the ones that we know how to do, you know, like rooftop solar, we know how to do that. I would just add, when you see the spreadsheet and the explanation that will go along with it, for each of the scoring bins that I showed you, for each of the sub-criteria, well, the way that Zach and I did this is we took the definitions that you guys laboriously worked through in the subcommittee and spent a lot of time figuring out what does that mean. And we used that as the criteria, and then we kind of thought about how do you apply that to this particular instant, to these particular actions. So each one of these sub-criteria has its own little set of defined by the commission. What does that mean, and how do you evaluate it? You know, for instance, with on technical feasibility, part of it was on technical maturity, and part of it was how much are you relying on the maximum potential to get there in order to make the achievement, or is it 25% of what's maximum potential? On the political feasibility, to know how much behavioral change does it take to get people to do this, and another part of the political feasibility was the legislative, how much capital, how much political capital, based on how much capital is actually required, does it take to get this over the finish line, to get approved, to get authorized? And so it gets more detailed and more nuanced as you get down into the weeds.
I'm mindful of our time. We've just got a couple minutes left. I think we can spend a little more time on this because it's a good conversation. Gabriella, you had your hand up. Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about the Inflation Reduction Act and if there's an overlay here that we need to consider. I don't know, maybe I missed and wasn't paying attention. Maybe that somehow has been integrated into the risk and uncertainty part of it in some way, but there's an inevitability, and to the point that Rep. Helm was, talking about with his legislation, that there's going to be every effort to maximize access to those resources. Should there be a swimming with that tide? Does that need to be a big consideration here in terms of what's recommended? Because that's going to, I mean, those funds are going to be here, and that is going to bend the curve, the direction of spending, and at a minimum having that context in the narrative. If there's not enough time, because it hasn't even come into focus yet. The federal agencies have not yet released their criteria, but we know broad buckets of that. So it just seems like such an important thing to acknowledge in this report in some way. And if there is a crosswalk, perhaps, so not proposing a new criteria at this late stage, but some crosswalk that can happen, it seems like that's going to be super important information. Senator Dembro can speak to that better than me, but it seems like that will be hugely important.
Absolutely. And to go back to the framework recommendations, we do have that as a recommendation. And so I do think it would be good for us to be able to include information on each of these actions as to whether or not that's something that's currently in the IRA or not. So a really good point.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and we did discuss that, and like, for instance, the IRA actually was approved as we were doing the scoring. And by approved, some of these programs have literally one sentence in them because of the budget reconciliation rules, and they don't have anything about how much, what kind, and so it was impossible to actually assign anything to them. But we do know, like, for instance, there's going to be things for climate reduction projects, heat pumps, weatherization. Oregon's getting $113 million to do weatherization in state homes, but we didn't know exactly how that's going to play out. So we kind of, like, some places it might, some places it will, but we didn't know how much. So we kind of was an all or nothing thing in this round of scoring about how you deal with the federal incentives. But we definitely realized that, and we didn't want to put the scale on something when we didn't know about something else, and didn't put the thumb on the scale of that one. But in Tigger 2.0, that's definitely going to be one of the primary things that we look at as it actually gets more defined and programmatic rules start rolling out, which is going to be out throughout 2023. Because
I do think we can include
those for 5 years.
We can include information that we do know about the programs in the roadmap as part of that sixth recommendation that we have for, I think it's the sixth one in the framework for making sure we're well aligned for receiving those funds. Senator Dembro.
Yeah, no, I was just going to reiterate that we're, a long way from being able to count on those resources. The first step is to know what's available. The second is to, line up our requests and try to make sure that we actually get some of that funding. But I will say that, as we lay out the priority areas as a result of this analysis, that can help us, I think, as we're putting in our requests for federal funding. That's where there could be real value here, in terms of creating a sense of urgency and to be able to let our federal partners know what could be achieved if we were to get a piece of this funding.
Well, also chunks of it are, I think, by formula. Alan or Zach, you probably know that. So those are for sure, and certainly there'll be plenty of competitive funds, but there'll be a lot that's just by formula to the state. So we know for sure that that's coming.
Absolutely. Okay, any last comments from commissioners? Then I'm going to try and summarize what I heard. Okay, so I heard in terms of prioritization, lots of support for really looking at the greenhouse gas benefits relative to political uncertainty. There was a suggestion that that might have had too high of points, recognizing that it's a small portion, but may be better to focus more on the technical and technical feasibility and timing relative to the risk and uncertainty, and potentially use that as the way we put actions into categories for study and for future study, rather than just the moving around of the actions, and so that we'd be really clear about that, and then an interest in making sure that whatever we can say about the IIJA and IRA and how that fits in with these actions or would support these actions going forward, that would be helpful to make clear in the results. Does that reflect the discussion we just had? And
Chair McDonald, I think it does. I guess I had one question. Just we didn't talk much about co-benefits and how to also prioritize or consider, and just want to clarify that when we're summarizing as focusing on greenhouse gas reduction emissions, does the commission also want those that have the most co-benefits attached, or something else?
what I heard Commissioner Jackson say was that, kind of in thinking about prioritization, emphasize GHG, but then look at co-benefits and the cost effectiveness as another way to kind of sort or just or describe the actions, so that people can make their own decisions about how to prioritize things. You want to add to that, Commissioner Jackson?
I guess that is correct. And definitely, I think is, to summarize, it's to really be action driven. How do we really make sure that the efforts being made are producing the results to meet the goals? Just today, we've had a lot of discussion about rooftop solar. And, we won't go into the weeds today, but definitely maybe offline we have a conversation. Is I think we know enough about rooftop solar that we don't have to spend a lot of time studying, but at the same time, putting rooftop solar in an area that's predominantly overcast is not getting the results you want, versus putting it in areas in which we can get the maximum benefit. Really looking into the weeds, not at this meeting, but for staff to understand kind of how do what the actions move the needle, while making sure that we're moving towards the desired outcomes, because it's as much cost and effort to put rooftop solar in area that's overcast, that or that's underutilized, that doesn't require the solar power, to putting in areas where we know that also the power is not hydropower, right? That's where you're really going to get the differences. So really focusing the actions in detail. The devil's in the detail all the time, but I just, so that's why I'm like saying, like, let's focus on the outcomes. And then within those big outcomes is cost, all the values, not just cost effective, but all the co-benefits that we can prioritize there.
I think your comments get into the how steps, and so that's an important thing that we want to emphasize in the report, is that we need to further work on how. I guess one of the things that I would maybe emphasize in terms of the co-benefits, I thought it was I was really glad, Alan, that you picked the example of weatherization to kind of show us how it bounces back and forth across the prioritization. When you look at GHG benefits really high, when you look at cost effectiveness kind of low, when you look at co-benefits again really high. And so in my mind, we wouldn't necessarily want to only prioritize the things that hit both of those additions, but may want to pull some things out that really have that high co-benefit. Because one of the things that we discussed as we were looking at the co-benefits in the subcommittee, as well as in the commission, was just the real importance of us using this as an opportunity, not just to level the playing field, but to, really kind of help address the long-term impacts of all sorts of things on underserved communities and frontline communities. So I want to make sure, at least from my perspective, I want to make sure that we're taking a pretty strong lens on co-benefits.
Yeah, in that particular residential weatherization, the two IRA programs, HERA and Homes, 113 million for weatherization, easy win for the Global Warming Commission should say, yes, we should do that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay,
if I can just jump in on that, Chair McDonald, I wanted to very much lift up what you were saying. That's a huge priority for Oregon Health Authority. And also we talked about in the subcommittee and in previous commission meetings, the fact that we just didn't have time and didn't have the resources in terms of the consulting power to dig in and really clarify those co-benefits. But also the, oh my gosh, I think I lost my train of thought. Well, there was another brilliant thing, no doubt. I'll put it in the chat if I think of it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, I did. I was thinking that it would be important to remind folks that, while Alan and Zach did an amazing job of analyzing all of this information, and I do think it provides some really helpful information for the roadmap. We recognize that in going forward, the next time we do this, we really want to be able to reach out to communities, get stronger input on the co-benefits that Oregonians writ large, especially those underserved and frontline communities, value, and put more effort into putting that into our analysis next time. But we didn't want to not do it because, or not include a co-benefits analysis because it is a really important consideration on how we think of how. And I think we've got some good results to go with. And can make it better next time. Zach, does that kind of help?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I remember the other thing is just to flag the cost effectiveness is not taking into consideration right now, that we need to flag, doesn't take into consideration right now other costs the state pays that these investments will help reduce. So it's underrepresents the cost effectiveness. For example, health payments that the state makes. Thanks.
Okay. With that, I think we need to wrap this discussion and move on to our next agenda item. So I think you've got, go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, when we talked about the recommendations at our last meeting, we have a draft framework that included 6 overarching recommendations, and then recommendation 4 and 5 had multiple points underneath it. So there were, probably closer to a dozen areas for discussion. We held off on talking about the third criteria because that was going to be, or the third element, because that was the purpose of the discussion today. but we talked about all of those, and I think you flagged those in the next slide, Zach. And so yeah, I think we talked about a couple of other ones in 4, as well as maybe one other in 5. But
the ones that are flagged here are the ones that we had extensive discussion about and needed either follow-up or kind of rewriting of the recommendations or new concepts.
Great. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah.
And so staff, one of the main areas was the discussion that we had of goals. And the commission, I think, was of one mind in wanting, or at least the spoke up were of largely of one mind relative to strengthening the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. But we wanted more information to help provide additional context for what those recommendations should be. And so staff did a great job of pulling together some information to help us with the, think through what we might recommend to the legislature in terms of improvements to the goals. And as we heard earlier, Senator Dembro is advancing legislation that could that this conversation could be relevant to in the 2023 session, which is exciting to hear. So we are going to dig in now and really talk through the proposal that staff have made in terms of identifying the, or thinking through what recommendations we want to make as a commission relative to strengthening Oregon's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So I'll hand it to you, Zach.
Thanks, Chair McDonald. And just before I hop from this slide, in addition to the conversation around the greenhouse gas reduction goals, we wanted to bring back discussion on the recommendation around the Global Warming Commission's membership. There were some ideas that came up around voting and non-voting members. So after the bulk of the conversation will be on the greenhouse gas reduction goals, but also just want to flag that there's a couple more slides after that, one on the membership. And then also we realized at the last meeting that we didn't get to cover the full extent of the previous 2020 biennial report that the commission submitted. There were like 30 plus recommendations, and we did include and reference certain ones in the draft recommendations, but just wanted to check in with the commission to be able to make sure that everyone feels good about the path that we're proposing to take to try to take a look at those again and see if there are others that we need to incorporate or move on from some of them. So just want to flag that, again, the bulk of the conversation, there'll be a lot of slides that I'll go through on the greenhouse gas goals. And then I think we should probably pause there to have the conversation, and then I'll
yes,
we can wrap up with those last 2 quick ones.
That sounds great, Zach. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. All right. So Chair McDonald did a good job of laying out and summarizing the conversation around the greenhouse gas reduction goals recommendation from the last meeting. The commission, expressed a strong interest in recommending updated goals based on the best available science, asked us to take a look at what other states are doing, and then also suggested the concept of ensuring that the goals are updated based on the best available science moving forward into the future. So we put together a memo, which is now on the website. And so there's a lot more detail, and I'll have a couple of slides to break some of these down. But I wanted to start with high level, the 4 recommendations that we have to try to address what the commission was asking for. So the first one really focuses on putting policy in place to determine what are we actually shooting for in terms of limiting global warming. The Paris Agreement has a 2 degrees Celsius target, but also says it would be great if we could reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And we know that every increment of higher temperatures results in worse impacts to Oregon's economy and people and the rest of the US and other countries and the like. So the 1.5 degree target we feel like is an important science-based target to have the state be focused on. And then once you say that, you then design the goals to try to meet that. If you want to have a target that allows for warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius, then you might have less ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. So that's the first point that we thought would be important to note in a recommendation. The second is to then update the sector-based greenhouse gas emission reduction goals to reflect the best available science. So basically to meet in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, and then align with other state and national goals, which I'll talk more about. There are a number of states that have even mentioned 1.5 degrees Celsius in their legislation to make the point that their goals are also trying to reach that more ambitious goal. And then the third, there is a lot of discussion in the science, and as well as many states and national, and even our federal goal has a net zero goal attached to it. And there's been a lot of conversation and work done by the Commission around natural working lands and carbon sequestration. And at the same time, net zero is a somewhat undefined term, or it depends how you define it. And so we are suggesting that the Commission consider recommending to the legislature that the Global Warming Commission continue to study the issue and recommend a net zero goal based on the potential to increase carbon sequestration through land sector actions. And the important point here is that the net zero goal should be separate from and in addition to the sector-based emission reduction goals. That is the Global Warming Commission work on the Natural and Working Lands proposal noted that, and it is also good practice to have that, and you'll see as I run through some of what other states are doing, you'll see that kind of additional goal on top of strong sector-based goals. And I should say that when I say sector-based goals, that's how we do our goals now currently, just to clarify. And then lastly, the fourth draft recommendation for consideration is to better enable periodic updates to Oregon's climate goals based on best available science. And we're still trying to figure out how to best have that mechanism work. Currently, the Global Warming Commission can recommend updated goals based on best available science to the legislature. At the same time, that hasn't worked so well in terms of a temporal aspect. A number of years ago, I think it was about 7 years, submitted or recommended the idea that we needed an interim target, a 2035 target, and that is still not in legislation. There are efforts, as we heard from Senator Dembro earlier, to update the goals. That 2035 goal, or very close to it, was included in the executive order in 2020. But again, there was a time lapse of about 5 years there. And so as we're trying to make sure to have urgent action based on the science, it's important that the goals track that. So we'll be continuing the conversation internally, and also, welcome ideas today if you all have about how to better enable those updates in the future. And we plan to bring back some more specifics on that at the January meeting. Okay, so that's just the high-level overview. I'm going to zero in on just the second recommendation, the sector-based greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, where we'll start to talk about 2030, 2035, 2050, all that. But I wanted to give you the full gamut that all of these are kind of a package that we see working together. Okay, so this is a lot going on here, and I'm going to break it down step by step. But we looked at the IPCC related science and goals, Oregon goals, other state goals, and we put together this table to try to help facilitate comparison and conversation, and so I'm hoping it does that. It's also in the memo, and there are a number of footnotes attached to it, so I kept the footnotes out to keep this clean, but please do take a look at those. So the first column on the left shows the source of the goal. So as I included, you can see the first two are Oregon. The first one is our statutory goal. The second one is the executive order goals. And then we included TIGR scenario projections, and then we did like an extrapolation of the DEQ's climate protection program numbers to apply them statewide. We also looked at the IPCC reports and the recommended goals there. We looked at the federal goals, and then we looked at other state goals that you can see at the bottom. Now, moving over to the next column, the targets. So this is largely why we put this table together, because you can see that the goals differ in multiple ways. So they differ in the percentage reduction, the year by which the reduction should happen, and also the baseline year to compare. So if you turn your eye to the middle of the chart, just looking at the IPCC ones, the special report called for 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. And then the most recent sixth assessment called for 43% below 2019 by 2030 levels. So different numbers, different baseline years. So we needed to try to figure out how to kind of equalize across all of these different numbers, and this is what we came up with, which then leads me to the next grouping of columns. So we wanted to show how Oregon's total emissions would decline if the respective targets were applied to Oregon's emissions. So for whatever baseline year the respective target had, say 1990 or 2010, we included Oregon's emissions for that year and then showed how the emissions would decrease based on the specific goals. So we used updated draft data from DEQ that will be published soon for the baseline years. So some of the baseline data might be a little different than you've seen in the past. Some of that is due to updates to the calculations and modeling that happens on a pretty regular basis with DEQ's greenhouse gas emission reduction data. So I mentioned we also included the TIGR scenario projections as another point of comparison, which is that third row. And this is the one where we actually have data for each of the years, so you can kind of see each of the milestone years, 2030, 2035, 2040, 2040, 2045, and 2050, and you can kind of see the trajectory there. Okay, so using this chart, we can see a couple of things. And again, just as a reminder, you will see in this chart labels of net zero in some of the 2045 and 2050 columns. And I see that the California net zero actually is 2045. It didn't move over there, but what I want to say about the net zero is just that, remember, we said as part of the recommendation that we would have a sector, we would have net zero as separate from the sector-based goals. So I'm going to focus on the sector-based goals, or the numerical goals here. So what we can see, I would say, first, about halfway or so down, you'll see Washington's goals. And Washington their goals would result in the strongest reductions in 2030, and then also over time. So you can see, by 2050, you're at 3 million metric tons, which is the lowest on this list. And then moving your eye back up to the TIGR scenario projections close to the top there, the 2030 TIGR scenario projections are not that far off from Washington's 2030 goal. TIGR scenario is at 33, Washington's at 31 million metric tons. And then these are also consistent with the IPCC 1.5 pathways, which show about 35 to 37 million metric tons, and actually are a little bit more ambitious than those. Similarly, the TIGR projections through 2040 track Washington's goals pretty well. So it's 17 using the Washington goal and 18 to 20 using the TIGR projections. And the range for the TIGR projections is just because we had two scenarios, the hybrid and the electrification, and they differ a little bit. Okay, so then where things diverge, though, is in 2050. Washington's goals would result in much stronger emissions reductions in 2050 compared to the TIGR projections and our existing goals. So we need to zero in a bit more on that. The IPCC is anywhere between 11 and net zero, and our current goals exceed those. The other 2050 goal that we have in Oregon relates to the climate protection program. And roughly half of the state's emissions are under that goal. So we also took a look at what would happen if you used the CPP goals and applied as an overall state goal. And this is not saying that that is the case. It's we tried to just do an extrapolation, and you can see that you would actually land, it's the fourth row down, you'd land at 6 million metric tons, which is in between kind of where the IPCC is, and also a significant difference down from our current goals. So to try to, I will say, we also, with the CPP, we were considering a different baseline of 1990 levels. The CPP has a 2017 to 2019 baseline level, and there's really not a ton of difference. It's about 0.6 million metric tons. So if we were to want to recommend that goal to be consistent with how our goals are currently written, it would be, we would suggest saying below a 1990 level instead of the 2017-2019 baseline that the CPP has. So towards that end, to try to help focus the options, there are two general overall schema that staff suggests the commission consider. And those are, so option one would be to recommend goals for 2030, 2040, and 2050. And then the other one would be to set goals for 2035 and 2050, similar to the structure that we currently have, at least through the executive order. So for the first option, the commission has been talking about potentially accelerating the 2035 goal to 2030. So that's what the scenario analysis is based on. And if you do that, then there would be a gap between our 2050 goal. So it would be good to have, we think it would be good to have also a 2040 goal to be able to keep on track. So with that said, Washington's goals provide a pretty ready-made option for the first schema. As I mentioned, the TIGR analysis largely tracks those goals through 2040. Washington's 2030 goal is 45% below 1990 levels compared to the TIGR 2030 goal, which would be about 42 to 43%. And then Washington's 2040 goal is 70% below 1990 levels, while the TIGR 2040 projection is 66 to 69%. So literally just about a 1% difference if you go to the higher range. So like the 2030 and 2040 goals, Washington's numerical 2050 goal is also consistent with the best available science to avoid warming of 1.5 degrees. Turning to the second schema on the right there, the TIGR scenario projections could be used to identify a stronger 2035 goal instead of accelerating the 2035 goal to 2030. And if you did that, it would be at least 60% below 1990 levels. And then the question becomes, okay, so for the corresponding 2050 goal in this schema, what would you do? And certainly could consider looking at the Washington goal of 95% below as in the other option. Another option, which is presented here, is to recommend a minimum of at least 90% below 1990 levels by 2050. And that is kind of using the extrapolation I talked about of the climate protection program goals applied across all of the emissions for the state. And that would be a substantial increase over the statutory and executive order 2050 goals and more consistent with the current best available science. In addition, as I mentioned, roughly half of the state's emissions are essentially already moving towards this goal as a result of DEQ's program. Further, the electricity sector is slated to reduce emissions by 100% well before the state by 2040 as a result of HB 2021. So we thought that this might be a good bookend to the conversation of where to consider increasing the 2050 goal to having this CPP related one and the one on the left with Washington's 95%. Okay, so I think
can I just and then I think there's a third option, which would be to use the 2030, 2040, but to use the CPP for the 2050.
Yep, thank you. Yes, and to that point, there are multiple mix and match options. Another option that we thought about on option 2 is the commission could say, well, maybe do a 2035 and a 2045 goal. And we can change, we can do the calculations to try to get there based on whatever the commission wants to do. We just tried to offer 2 that could start conversation. And so that's what we're looking for at this point. And I'm going to pause to see if there are questions about what I went through, and then if there are any thoughts from the commission.
Commissioners? For hands.
Be logging out. This is Commissioner Jackson. I did put all my comments in the chat, so hopefully that's helpful. Definitely, I know, Zach, that a lot of the work that you've done can kind of lead us towards a direction, but apologies for dropping off. I try to put as many of my comments so the rest of the commission take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Jackson. Appreciate your participation today. I'm only seeing one comment, but it may be that I'm missing oh, there we go. There are the rest of them. I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Commissioner Apter. Yeah, I was trying to look at the chat, so I'll go ahead and copy this.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Zach. That I again can only imagine how many hours went into that, and it was really great to see all of the different overlapping, possibilities and targets. I agree with Commissioner Jackson. I think option one, at least of these two, and interested if others have thoughts in terms of a potential combination, but of the options presented, I think option one is definitely the strongest. It is really important, as we know that we have a near-term goal, and specifically that we have a 2030 goal that is aligned with global targets and ambition to achieve and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I definitely think we need a 2030 goal. And I like the at least 95% goal for the long-term 2050 target, given everything Zach outlined in terms of the various policies and programs that are already in place, but looking at different sectors of the economy and of our top emitting sectors. We need to recognize that all of those work together, and ideally we're continuing to build on that. So we need to keep ambition as the North Star here. So I'll leave it at that. Interested in hearing from other commissioners.
Senator Dembro?
Yeah, thanks. So is the plan that we will try to make a decision by the January meeting after this initial discussion? Yeah, I would really encourage that because, I mentioned earlier that one of the bills we're putting in is a proposal to change the goals. And I really, I think it's important that whatever is included in the legislation, it be the result of a recommendation from this commission. So, if the timing could work out, that would really be great.
Absolutely. Other commissioners? Commissioner Reitman?
Yeah, I just would say that I concur with all that's been said. Appreciate all the effort that's gone into getting where we are, and it seems like that's the way to go, option one.
Let's see if we have other hands up. Colin, if you're still, it looks like you're still with us. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have any comments that would be for the good of the order on these two options, would appreciate hearing from you.
Chair, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. I'm not sure whether I'm on my phone or my computer. I'm connected by both. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, I guess I would observe that we, as Zach's table so nicely illustrated, we have a lot of different goals and targets, and some enforceable, some aspirational. And I think one of the questions that Odo staff posed to DEQ is, would any objectives adopted by the commission or by legislature, if they were numerically any way different than, for example, our CPP targets, would that be problematic? Would that effectuate a change in DEQ's program? And to cut to the chase, I think the answer is no. I think if there are more aspirational targets adopted by the commission or by legislature, that would not have an immediate effect on our programs like CPP. It could guide future action by our commission, perhaps, to adjust the program to be in alignment, but that would take an action, a vote by our commission to do. So if that is the question, it was one that was posed to us offline previously. But Chair, if you had other information you wanted from DPQ, let me know. I'm happy to try to add that here to the meeting.
I wondered about the 2050 goal and the two alternatives, and I think this is a question for Odo as well. You know, is the 95% below in the realm of possibility? I hear you folks talking about, you know, we kind of know how to get to 90, which is great. But you know, how to get beyond that is a little more challenging. So I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
I guess quickly, I think it would require the difference between 90 and 95, 90% roughly could be achieved by going to zero carbon energy across all energy used in the economy. Going much further would require a reduction in non-energy sources, things like industrial processes or agricultural sector. That it's, you know, a lot of literature points to those being more challenging emission sources to abate. Not that it's particularly easy to decarbonize the entire energy sector either, but going much further than 90% really would necessitate significant reductions in addition to zeroing out all of our energy use.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Alan, any perspectives you want to share on that same question?
The only thing I would say is that I agree with what Colin said, but the only thing I would say is that all of it's doable. It's all technically, it's more about political will than it is about technical capability in most of these cases. I mean, we're already doing with HB 2021 100% renewables by 2045. So, and CBP is 90% by 2045 as well. So the technology is there to do it. It's a matter of being able to muster everybody's capabilities and political will to get there.
Including the industrial sector?
Industrial, commercial customers, yeah, exactly.
So you feel like it's across the board, it's doable?
Well, there's still going to be, you know, that's why it's 95, because there's going to be hard to decarbonize sectors. And in some cases, the industrial and commercial sector is where that's going to be. So like, for instance, in the industrial sector, that's where renewable hydrogen can come in, where you could just switch that out without, I mean, it's probably overstating it, but without that much of difficulty, and be able to electrify or decarbonize as opposed to electrify it. Transportation sector is probably more of the difficult part than all the rest.
Good segue to Suzanne. Did you want to weigh in on that?
Sort of. I had two comments, and this is maybe speaking a little bit more towards aspirational targets, and it's kind of a superficial comment, but one thing I find is that when we use these different percentages in different years and different baseline years, it's a little harder to communicate on a national and global level. So it seems like momentum is building as we coalesce around common goals. Doesn't mean we can't be unique and set ones that are meaningful to the actual work on the ground. Just a consideration. And so I like the table that you did because it speaks to that, right? Like if we all are speaking with one voice, setting a common target, I think that's helpful on a larger scale. And then specific to the ones on the screen here, we are challenged in some of our data sets to have a 1990 baseline. So there's a bit of guesswork there. When we did a greenhouse gas inventory of ODOT operations and materials and fuels, we didn't really have data for 1990. So it was harder to set that than to go with the 50% and 180, 90, whatever the final finish line is. So just a few items for consideration.
Thank you. Senator Dembro?
Yeah, just, as we're thinking about this over the next month or so, it would be helpful to have a sense of what practical difference the different goals would make, right? That is, what would, if we were to look at 90% versus 95% or 95% versus 90%, how does that change our, practical goal setting? I mean, in terms of activities, it would be good to know that as we're setting these goals. Just, and again, to remind you that, we are looking at a moving target in terms of our goals, right? I mean, these can be amended over time as we have a better understanding of our capabilities. And, this, whatever goal we're setting next month is not going to be necessarily our goal for the next 2 decades, right?
That's a good point, Senator Dembro. I like the idea of being as aspirational as we can be. But I kind of agree with you, Senator Dembro. It'd be good to kind of maybe spend just a little bit of time recognizing that over the next month, there's a lot of that next month is time when it'll be hard for us to get in touch with people. But I think it would warrant a little bit of exploration about that. What does it really mean? What's the difference between 95 and 90 in terms of what it would mean from an implementation perspective? So I think that would be good work for us to try and do. It'll probably be something that we won't be able to communicate back out with before the meeting, just given the holidays, but we can certainly try. But I do really like making sure we have a 2030 goal, just to keep the pressure up. And I think there's good reason to add a 2040 goal for the same reason. There are some states, Massachusetts has a goal for every 5 years from now until 2050, and they have it broken down by sector. So there are people that are looking at this quite often, and that kind of goes to that last area of recommendations that we're not going to dig into, but we haven't had a good mechanism where we can update the goals because we don't have rulemaking authority for these kinds of things. We don't have at this time as the commission, so that makes it a little challenging for us to do it. And it depends on whether the legislature is interested in picking this up. And as the memo defined, we've had and as Zach mentioned, we've had some big lags between updating recommendations and when they get considered in legislation. So, but I like the idea of being ambitious, of having a 2030 goal. I think the 45% is pretty close enough to the TIGR results that I feel good about that. It's definitely going to mean that we're going to have to go all out and making sure we're keeping the pressure, or making sure we're resourcing the things that we've identified and are already in action in the programs and regulations adopted and under development, as well as bringing on a lot of new programs as well. I don't know if any of the other commissioners have comments that you want to share on any reflections based on this discussion. Well, with that, I think that's good input for staff. Zach, do you feel like you have direction for what next?
Yes, thank you. That was, I appreciate everyone weighing in. And I did see a note in the chat of, from someone from the public had an interest in being able to comment on the goals discussion. I would defer to you, Chair, if you want to have that opportunity, or there's the opportunity for written comment, and then
Why don't we go through the rest of your presentation and then come back to this if we have time? I don't think we're going to need 10 minutes for next steps because we kind of lined out the schedule, but but let's make sure you get the rest of your presentation made.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I was going to suggest that I think this should be pretty quick. So, okay. So the other recommendation that we just wanted to come back to the commission with, because there was a lot of good discussion around, was membership additions. And the commission was interested in adding the Oregon Housing Agency to the list of non-voting agency members. The commission also suggested adding a youth representative as a voting member, and then also potentially adding an Environmental Justice Council representative, or potentially some type of regular reporting requirement from the Environmental Justice Council, recognizing resource constraints and challenges of being in multiple places and trying to input into multiple processes. So with that feedback, we are coming back to the commission to say, this is pretty obvious, but we think it would be a good idea to add the housing agency as a non-voting agency member. We're still checking with them to make sure that there's not any issues there, but that is something that we think would be a good step. And then we agree also with trying to have a youth representative as a voting member. And what we did here was, if you add just one member as a voting member, we'd have an even number. So currently we have 11, you'd get to 12. And for quorum issues and potential votes, we thought it would be good to try to get back to an odd number of members. And given some of the conversation we had around what to do with the Environmental Justice Council representative, we're suggesting that we add a voting member slot for a member with experience in environmental justice. And that could end up being an Environmental Justice Council representative. It also could be a community member with who's experiencing living in an environmental justice community, or has experience with environmental justice communities. So that's how we thought of packaging it, and just wanted to check in and make sure. And I think I should say, given Senator Dembro's presentation earlier, it sounded like these would potentially be moving forward and thinking similarly. So just wanted to check in on that piece. And then I'm just going to finish up on the next slide, and then if there's any comments, we can talk through them. We just wanted a flag for the commission that we did look at and are continuing to look at all of the 36 recommendations in the 2020 biennial report from the commission. Many were acted upon. There was passage of 100% clean legislation was one of those recommendations, which happened. But there were also many that were partially acted upon or not achieved, or need to start action on. So some are relevant to the draft roadmap recommendations, and we noted those in the draft recommendations framework where applicable. But there are others that are not currently addressed in specific draft roadmap recommendations, some of which could be included in the draft roadmap recommendations or may need some new recommendations. So, for example, there was a recommendation to create a state-sponsored green bank that has become even more of a hot topic these days with the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the federal money that's coming. So we might be able to tuck that into the recommendation that we have around positioning the state to be able to take advantage of the federal funding. And then another example is there was a recommendation to require use of social cost of carbon to inform investments and regulations. That one doesn't have a perfect fit in the framework that we put together. So that might be one that would need a new recommendation for consideration for the commission, not saying that it would have to be a recommendation. So we're trying to just go back through and raise those, and just wanted to make sure that the commission was comfortable with the idea of us trying to slot these in or think about new recommendations around them. And that's all I've got there.
Great, thank you, Zach. Any comments on the additions to the commission? Okay, it seems like we're in support of that concept. And then on the next topic, the recommendations from the 2020 report, especially those that either have partially or not been adopted. Any concerns about pulling some of those into the recommendations? My understanding, Zach, is that you're reaching out to sister agencies to kind of double check where some of those are currently, and that you would do that in order to kind of double check what we think still needs to be done.
Yep, that's right. There are some where it wasn't totally clear, and just want to make sure that we're getting it right.
Comments on this? Hearing none, I will take that as support for moving forward on that front. And then do you have the next step slide up? Is that at the end of the document, or do you need to go?
We don't, but I can shift back there.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that while we have, who was it from that wanted to comment?
Actually, not sure. I just.
It was Tim Miller.
Chair. Oh, great. Tim, you're welcome to provide comment.
Thank you so much, Chair McDonald and members. I really appreciate the chance to weigh in just a little bit more. And I realize this commenting on these goals has a little bit of moralizing, so it's baked into this discussion. So I apologize if I sound that way. But for concrete feedback, I really appreciate the team's work to potentially define a goal for each decade, like you have in option 1. And boy, that chart is the clearest thing I've ever seen in comparing goals. Thank you, Zach, for that. I would add, though, I'm a little concerned about the notion of goals that then we revise as they look doable. I think that's different from what a goal is. I think a goal is an aspiration that we should, it should be something we're trying to achieve, and it's a stretch goal, whether we know exactly how we're going to get there or not. We have a near-term goal, whether it's 2030, 2035, it's not totally clear how we're going to do that politically or from a feasibility standpoint either. But I don't think that gives us license to take softer goals in 2050 just because we can't quite see through the fog. It does, I think, mean we can take a net concept to say, hey, not our whole economy can see themselves in a zero emissions world, but maybe in a net zero world, folks can see themselves, whether it's industrial or agriculture or others. So anyway, I think the only reason to update goals would be if science said we need to update goals. Like if science 5 years from now said, hey folks, actually we need to be at zero by 2045 or by 2040, then we got to figure out how to get there. So, and then the last comment I would make, just to encourage ambition from you all, my understanding is that humanity needs to be at net zero by 2050. We're in the first world. We have the resources to do this. We got to beat that goal for our friends across the world who aren't going to be able to make that goal. So 2050 is not good enough for those of us in the first world here. I get that politically, maybe that's about all we can achieve, but if we're not shooting for at least net zero by 2050 or 2045, how the heck is humanity going to get there? Because we got the resources, we have the technology. And for anybody who's concerned that, hey, this is a global challenge, why should we lead? Well, there's opportunity in leadership. If we lead, there's economic benefit as well as equity benefit and co-pollutants benefit and all that. So just to encourage your ambition, we're in the first world. We got to beat the global requirement. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. And Tim, could you just identify yourself for the record? I think
Yeah, sorry. Tim Miller, I use he, him pronouns, and I'm speaking today from my position as director of PECI, and we invest in equitable climate policy.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I do want to also recognize one of Zach's colleagues, Amy Schlesser. If I'm saying her last name correctly, she really helped out a lot on that memo, and it's great to have her on board at Odo. So I wanted just to recognize her contribution. Senator Dembro.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I want to say I agree with everything that Tim said and really appreciate the framing. We will have to be prepared to explain to people, what the effects of these different decisions are. I think we have a real role to play there in helping people understand, what. So what does it mean? What does it mean if we go to net zero? I mean, what changes will that provoke vis-a-vis our current goals, for example? And I think that's an important function we can provide.
My mind went to the same place, Senator Dembro, that it's in order to get broader acceptance on a goal, really being able to explain it and why it's important for us to do that. And some of the points you raised, Tim, I think are important points as part of that explanation, but also kind of understanding, what that means in terms of investments and savings and our reliability of our grid and some of the other kinds of things. I think we just have to be able to kind of talk that through with decision makers who are going to be important for us getting the policies enacted. So, but really appreciate the points that you've made today. Thank you. Okay, we have just 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and try and wrap us up. This is the same timeline that you saw earlier today. As we said, we extended the deadlines a little bit, added a meeting, extended the deadlines for public comment and added another meeting. So we do hope still to have the recommendations wrapped up at the end of January, early February, and then the whole report that could be made available by March 1st. So this is posted on our meeting website, and we'll make sure that we get notices out early to folks about the next meeting, and we'll do our best to get the materials out to you as early as possible. But while we are in the final stages and a lot of heavy lifting has been done, there's still some heavy lifting to do before we can wrap up. So we'll do our best and try and meet all the rest of the deadlines that we have on this. Just a reminder, the next meeting is January 13th in the morning from 9 to 1, I believe. And commissioners will get the save the date and the invitation on Monday. And we'll try and probably get a press release out potentially next week about the upcoming meeting as well as our agenda. But I'll talk to Zach about the feasibility and timing of getting that press release out, but we'll work to get that out as soon as possible. Anything you want to add, Zach or Alan?
I did just have one thing based on Senator Denborough's comments about the goals. So because we added a meeting, I think our thought was that we were going to finalize the recommendations at that second January, early February meeting. And just want to check in to make sure that that is okay timing, or we would we could bring the goals recommendation to the January 13th meeting as a to finalize, because by that point folks will have had a chance to provide written comment. We did think that there would be more discussion on it, but it seems like there's pretty good alignment from the commission on it already. So just wanted to check in because that is one difference maybe.
I would propose that we try and get it wrapped up at the January 13th meeting, but welcome your comments, Senator Denborough.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, if I think it's important to have a robust discussion, especially since a number of commissioners are not here today. And so if it's not finalized on January 13th, we're still within time to amend into February. So, as long as it's, before March, certainly, there we're getting a little, it's pushing it. But when is that February meeting planned? I'm sorry.
We haven't set it yet. It's between the January 30th and February 3rd. We are going to have a lot of things to discuss at that meeting. And so if we can think about a smaller handful of recommendations that we could try and finalize on the 13th, I think that'd be ideal.
Yeah, if we could get the goals, a final
Goals done,
recommendation by, mid-February, that would be fine.
We'll do our best to get them done as early as possible.
Great, thanks.
All right. Well, with the great meeting, great participation, really appreciate it. Sorry, our ranks were a little thin today because it was really important information. I will send a note out to all the folks that missed the meeting and just really encourage them to go back and listen to the recording and review the PowerPoint and all the great information that's been provided to us today. With that, I will close the December 16th meeting of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
We have a